When Ronan Hale opened his cabin door that frozen February night in 1888, he expected death itself on his doorstep. Not a woman dressed in Boston silk, abandoned by the man who'd promised her everything. What he didn't expect was that saving her life would shatter his carefully built solitude, ignite a war with Wyoming's most powerful rancher, and force him to choose between the safety of isolation and the terrifying risk of love. This is their story. Stay until the end and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this tale travels. The wind didn't howl in Wyoming territory during February of 1888. It screamed. It tore across the high plains like a living thing with teeth and claws, ripping at anything foolish enough to stand against it. The blizzard had been building for 3 days now, each day worse than the last, until the world had disappeared entirely beneath a churning white darkness that swallowed landmarks, erased trails, and turned the 20-minute walk to the barn into a potentially fatal journey. Ronan Hale knew this wind. He'd survived 7 winters in this valley, each one testing whether he had the spine to endure another. At 34, he was what the townspeople of Stone Creek called established, which was their polite way of saying he owned land kept to himself and had successfully avoided dying, going crazy, or crawling back east like so many others had done. His cabin sat at the base of Copper Ridge, 3 miles from his nearest neighbor and 7 from town, which was exactly how he preferred it. The cabin itself was solid work, logs he'd cut and fitted himself, chinked with clay and moss, a stone fireplace that drew clean, and a roof that had survived everything the territory had thrown at it. 1 room, 1 bed, 1 chair, 1 table, 1 man. Everything numbered in singular terms, which suited Ronan just fine. He'd come west after the war, after Gettysburg had taken his brother and Chancellorsville had taken something harder to name from inside himself. He'd tried going back to Pennsylvania, back to the farm, and the girl who'd waited, but he'd found he couldn't breathe there anymore. The East felt too close, too crowded, too full of questions he couldn't answer and memories he couldn't outrun. So he'd come here, to this place where the sky stretched forever, and a man could ride for days without seeing another soul. He'd built this cabin with his own hands, cleared the land for grazing, and established a small herd that somehow survived each brutal winter. It wasn't much, not by the standards of the big ranchers who controlled most of the valley, but it was his. He owed no man, answered to no one, and that was worth more than gold. Tonight, the 3rd night of the storm, Ronan sat by his fireplace with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hands, listening to the wind try to tear his roof off. The fire crackled and popped, throwing dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls. His dog, a cattle dog mix named Bear, lay with his head on his paws, ears occasionally twitching at some sound beyond human hearing. The cabin was warm, the woodpile was stacked high, and he had enough supplies to last weeks if needed. He was as safe as any man could be in a Wyoming blizzard. He was thinking about checking the barn one more time. The horses would be nervous in this wind, when Bear's head snapped up. The dog's ears went rigid, pointed toward the door. Ronan set down his coffee and listened. Nothing but wind, the same endless screaming gale that had been battering the valley for days. Bear was probably just hearing a branch scraping the walls, or maybe a rabbit sheltering under the porch. But the dog stood now, hackles raised slightly, staring at the door with an intensity that made Ronan's hand drift toward the rifle propped beside the fireplace. Then he heard it. 3 knocks, faint and irregular, barely audible over the storm. Ronan's first thought was that a branch had fallen against the door. His second thought was that no branch knocked with such deliberate rhythm. He stood, crossing the small cabin in 4 strides, and put his hand on the door handle. Bear pressed against his leg, whining low in his throat. "Who's there?" Ronan shouted, but the wind swallowed his voice completely. The knocks came again, weaker this time. 3 gentle taps that couldn't possibly be heard unless someone was listening for them. Ronan threw the bolt and pulled the door open. The blizzard exploded into the cabin with such force it nearly knocked him backward. Snow and ice crystals blasted his face, blinding him. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in an instant. Bear yelped and retreated toward the fireplace. And there, framed in the doorway like some ghost conjured by the storm itself, stood a woman. She was dressed in what had once been fine clothing, a traveling dress of deep blue wool with brass buttons, now crusted with ice and torn at the hem. No coat, no shawl. Her hands were bare, her fingers blue-white with frostbite. Dark hair hung in frozen ropes around a face so pale it was almost translucent. She looked up at him with eyes that struggled to focus, took one stumbling step forward, and collapsed directly into his arms. Ronan caught her on pure instinct. She weighed almost nothing, her body cold as death except for one small spot of warmth at her core that told him she was still alive. Her lips were moving, trying to form words, but no sound came out except a thin whistle of breath. "Jesus Christ," Ronan breathed. He kicked the door shut behind him, staggering under her weight as the wind tried to rip them both back into the storm. The moment the door slammed, the cabin seemed to exhale, the roar of the blizzard dropping to a muffled howl. "What the hell? Who are you? Where did you come from?" The woman's eyes rolled back, her head lolled against his shoulder. She was unconscious, or close enough that it made no difference. Ronan's mind raced. This made no sense. His cabin was 3 miles from the nearest ranch, 7 from town. No one traveled in weather like this. No one could survive out in that storm for more than minutes. And this woman looked like she'd been walking for hours. Her dress was soaked through, frozen stiff in places. Her hands were like ice. How was she even alive? "Bear, move!" He carried her to the bed, his only bed, and laid her down as gently as his shaking hands would allow. She didn't respond, didn't move. Her chest barely rose and fell. "Stay with me," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Don't you dare die in my cabin, woman. I've got enough ghosts." He'd seen frostbite before, seen men lose fingers and toes and sometimes whole limbs to the cold, seen men who'd been caught in blizzards and barely lived to tell about it. The protocol was simple. Get them warm, but not too fast. Slow warming, or you could kill them just as surely as the cold would. Ronan grabbed every blanket he owned, all 3 of them, and piled them on the bed. But her dress was soaked through, freezing against her skin, and those wet clothes would kill her faster than the cold alone. His hands hesitated for just a moment, then he started working at the buttons of her dress, with fingers made clumsy by urgency. "I'm sorry," he said to her unconscious form, though he wasn't sure why he was apologizing. "But these clothes will kill you." The buttons were frozen, some of them cracked. He had to cut through the fabric in places, using his hunting knife with as much care as he could manage while his own hands trembled. The dress came away in pieces, revealing a thin chemise underneath, equally soaked. That had to come off too. Underneath, a corset, laced so tight he couldn't understand how she'd been breathing. He cut the laces, pulled it away, and finally she wore only her undergarments, which he left in place because he had some sense of decency, though what good decency did for a dying woman he couldn't say. Her skin was mottled, blotched with white patches where frostbite had set in. Her feet were the worst. He'd have to deal with those carefully. But first, warmth. He wrapped her in the blankets, tucking them around her like a cocoon, then lifted her again and carried her to the chair he pulled close to the fire. Not too close. He didn't want to warm her too fast, but close enough that the heat could start working into her core. He built up the fire, adding more wood until it roared in the fireplace. Then he filled his kettle with snow from the bucket by the door and set it to heat. Only then, with her wrapped and warming and the kettle beginning to steam, did Ronan notice the small carpet bag that had fallen just inside the door when she'd collapsed. He picked it up, surprised by its weight. Opening it, he found the practical contents of a traveling woman. A hairbrush, a few items of clothing neatly folded, a small leather purse containing $17 in bills and coins, and at the bottom, an envelope addressed in careful script. Miss Evelyn Ward, Boston, Massachusetts. So she had a name, Evelyn Ward, and she'd come from Boston, which explained the fine dress and the impractical shoes. But it didn't explain what she was doing at his door in the middle of a blizzard, 3 miles from anywhere. Ronan set the bag aside and knelt beside the chair. Evelyn, because now he couldn't think of her as just the woman, hadn't moved. Her breathing was shallow but steady. That was good. That meant she was alive, fighting. He took one of her hands in his and began rubbing it gently, carefully, trying to restore circulation without causing damage. "Who are you?" he murmured. "And what the hell happened to you?" The wind screamed outside, battering the cabin walls, as if angry that this one life had escaped its clutches. Ronan worked methodically, warming her hands, then her feet, checking constantly for the signs of frostbite damage. The tips of 3 fingers were white and hard, likely lost, or at least damaged. 2 toes on her left foot, the same, but the rest seemed salvageable, if he was careful, if he was lucky. When the water in the kettle was warm, not hot, just warm, he soaked cloths and applied them to her hands and feet, changing them frequently as they cooled. He did this for an hour, maybe more, losing track of time in the rhythm of the work. Heat cloth, apply, wait, remove, repeat. Slowly, gradually, color began to return to her skin. The deadly white faded to pink, then to something closer to natural flesh tone. She stirred once, murmuring something he couldn't understand but didn't wake. Ronan wrapped her hands and feet in dry cloths, then built up the fire again and moved her back to the bed, still cocooned in blankets. He pulled the chair beside the bed and sat down to watch her, to make sure she kept breathing, kept fighting. This was insane. This whole situation was absolutely insane. Women didn't just appear out of blizzards. They especially didn't appear at his door, miles from anywhere, in the middle of the worst storm he'd seen in years. And yet here she was, unconscious in his bed, her life literally in his hands. Ronan looked at the envelope again, then at the woman, at Evelyn. She was younger than he'd first thought, maybe mid-20s. Dark hair that would probably be beautiful when it wasn't frozen and matted. Fine features, high cheekbones, a determined chin. Even half dead and frozen, there was something about her that suggested strength, resilience. You didn't survive a walk through a Wyoming blizzard without both. "Who are you, Evelyn Ward?" he asked the silent room. "And who left you to die?" Because that's what had happened, wasn't it? Someone had left her. You didn't end up alone in a blizzard by accident. Someone had abandoned this woman, had sent her out into that storm, had left her to freeze to death. The thought made something cold and hard settle in Ronan's chest, something that had nothing to do with the weather outside. He'd seen cruelty before. War was nothing but cruelty dressed up in flags and drums. But this was different. This was personal, deliberate. This was someone looking at another human being and deciding their life meant less than nothing. Ronan stood and began cleaning up the mess he'd made. The torn clothing, the wet blankets, the scattered contents of her bag. He hung her dress by the fire to dry, though he doubted it would ever be truly wearable again. He organized her few possessions neatly on the table. He made coffee, strong and black, and sat drinking it while he watched her sleep, watching for any sign that she might be slipping away. Hours passed. The storm raged on, unrelenting. Bear eventually settled on the floor beside the bed, as if standing guard over this strange new presence in their cabin. Ronan dozed in his chair, jerking awake every time she stirred, but she never woke. Just shifted slightly, murmured something, then settled again. It was near dawn, though you couldn't tell by looking outside where the world was still white chaos, when her eyes finally opened. Ronan had just added wood to the fire and was turning back toward the chair when he saw her staring at him, confused and frightened. "Easy," he said, holding up his hands. "You're safe. You're in my cabin. You came to my door last night during the storm." Evelyn blinked at him, her eyes struggling to focus. She tried to sit up, then gasped and fell back, one hand clutching her head. "Don't try to move too fast," Ronan said, crossing to the bed. "You were half frozen. Your body needs time to recover." She looked down at herself, at the blankets wrapped around her, and her eyes widened. "My clothes were frozen solid and killing you," Ronan said bluntly. "I cut them off. I'm sorry, but it was that or let you die. Your dress is drying by the fire, and I left your undergarments. I'm not—" He stopped, frustrated by his own awkwardness. "I did what needed doing, nothing more." Evelyn studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice was rough, barely audible. "Water?" Ronan poured water from the kettle, cooler now, safe to drink, into a tin cup and brought it to her. She tried to hold it herself, but her hands shook so badly he had to steady it for her, helping her take small sips. "Not too much at once," he cautioned. "Let your stomach adjust." She drank half the cup, then fell back against the pillow, exhausted by that small effort. "Where am I?" "My cabin, 3 miles northeast of Stone Creek." My name's Ronan Hale. Evelyn, she said. Evelyn Ward. I know, I found your bag. He gestured to the table where her possessions sat neatly arranged. You're from Boston. Something flickered across her face. Pain, loss, something complicated. I was, she said softly. I'm not sure what I am now. Ronan pulled the chair closer and sat down. Can you tell me what happened? How you ended up at my door in the middle of a blizzard? Evelyn closed her eyes. For a moment he thought she'd fallen asleep again, but then she spoke, her voice steady despite its weakness. I was supposed to be married, mail-order bride. I answered an advertisement from a rancher here in Wyoming. His name was Silas Blackwood. Ronan's jaw tightened. He knew that name. Everyone in the valley knew Silas Blackwood. The man owned the largest ranch in 3 counties, had his hand in half the businesses in Stone Creek, and wielded his wealth and influence like a weapon. He was also known for his cruelty, his quick temper, and his absolute conviction that money could buy him anything he wanted. Go on, Ronan said quietly. I arrived yesterday on the afternoon train. He was supposed to meet me at the station, but he sent his foreman instead. The foreman drove me out toward the ranch, but about halfway there, Mr. Blackwood was waiting on the road. She paused, and Ronan saw her hands clench the blankets. He looked at me like I was livestock he was considering purchasing. Then he said I wasn't what he'd ordered, too thin, too Eastern, too educated. Apparently I'd made the mistake of using words with more than 2 syllables in my letters. Ronan felt that cold, hard thing in his chest grow colder, harder. He told his foreman to take me back to town, but then he changed his mind. Said he'd already paid for my train ticket, considered that payment enough for breaking the contract. Her voice wavered slightly. He gave me $10 and a note dissolving our agreement. Then he told his foreman to let me out, right there, on the road, with the storm already starting. Jesus Christ, Ronan breathed. And the foreman just did it? He argued, Evelyn said. To his credit, he argued. But Mr. Blackwood, he's not a man who tolerates argument. The foreman let me out at a fork in the road. He said the left path led to town, about 5 miles. He looked sorry. He gave me his gloves. She glanced at the table where her few possessions sat. I don't know what happened to them. I must have lost them. 5 miles, Ronan said, in a blizzard, with no coat. I had a coat, a traveling coat, wool, perfectly adequate for Boston. It was, she gestured vaguely, inadequate here. The wind tore it apart within a mile. The buttons ripped off, the seams split. I tried to hold it closed, but my hands were so cold I couldn't feel them anymore. Eventually, I just let it go. Let the wind take it. Ronan stood and paced to the window, looking out at the still raging storm. You walked 5 miles in this? I tried. I don't know how far I got. At the fork, I took what I thought was the left path, but the snow was so thick I couldn't see anything. I walked and nothing looked right. No town, no lights, nothing but white. I fell several times. After the 3rd or 4th time, I wasn't sure I could get up again. Then I saw your light. She opened her eyes and looked directly at him. I thought I was hallucinating. I thought I was already dead and seeing things, but I walked toward it anyway, because even a hallucination was better than freezing in the dark. And then I was at your door, and I knocked, and you... Her voice broke. You opened the door. Ronan turned back to face her. You took the wrong fork. You went northeast instead of south. You walked 3 miles in the exact opposite direction of town. Evelyn laughed, but there was no humor in it. Of course I did. Of course. If you'd taken the right fork, Ronan continued quietly, you'd have died. No one could walk 5 miles in that storm, even in the right direction. Taking the wrong fork saved your life because it brought you here before you'd gone far enough to be beyond saving. They looked at each other across the small cabin, and Ronan saw the moment when the full reality of what had happened settled over her. She'd nearly died. Would have died if she'd made one different choice, if the wind had blown 1 degree differently, if she'd fallen one more time and not gotten up. She'd survived by accident, by chance, by the sheer dumb luck of choosing the wrong path. I should be dead, she whispered. But you're not. Ronan said firmly. You're alive, and you're safe, and that bastard Blackwood isn't getting another chance at you. You understand me? Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. She blinked them back furiously, lifting her chin. I don't cry, she said. I didn't cry when my father died and left us with nothing. I didn't cry when I had to take the job as a seamstress working 14 hours a day. I didn't cry when I realized I'd never have anything more unless I did something desperate. And I'm not going to cry now. But the tears came anyway, silent and steady, tracking down her pale cheeks. Ronan stood awkwardly for a moment, then crossed to the bed and sat on the edge of it. Without thinking too hard about what he was doing, he took her hand, carefully, mindful of her damaged fingers. It's okay to cry, he said. You earned it. You survived something that should have killed you. You're entitled to some tears. Evelyn squeezed his hand with what little strength she had. I don't have time for tears. I need to figure out what to do next. I have $17 and nowhere to go. The train ticket back to Boston would cost most of that, and I have nothing to go back to anyway. I sold everything to come here. I burned every bridge. I was so sure this was my chance for something better, something more. I was such a fool. You weren't a fool, Ronan said. You were brave, desperate and brave, and you didn't do anything wrong. Blackwood did. He's the villain in this story, not you. Being right doesn't pay for food or lodging, Evelyn said bitterly. Being the victim doesn't change the fact that I'm stranded in Wyoming territory with no prospects and no options. Ronan was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he said, You'll stay here. Evelyn's eyes snapped to his face. What? Until the storm breaks and you figure out what comes next. You'll stay here. I've got food enough for two, and the cabin's warm. You take the bed, I'll take the floor. It's not much, but it's shelter, and it's safe. I can't. You can, and you will, Ronan said firmly. I'm not letting you walk back out into that storm, and I'm sure as hell not taking you into town where Blackwood might find you before you're ready to face him. You stay here. No arguments. Evelyn stared at him, and Ronan couldn't read the expression on her face. Suspicion? Gratitude? Fear? Maybe all three? Why would you do that? She asked finally. You don't know me. I could be anyone. I could be lying about everything. Are you? No? Then that's settled. Ronan stood, oddly uncomfortable with the gratitude he saw dawning in her eyes. Now, you need to rest. You've been through hell, and your body needs time to heal. I'll make something to eat. Are you hungry? Starving, Evelyn admitted. I haven't eaten since the train yesterday morning. Ronan nodded and moved to his small kitchen area, which was really just a counter and a few shelves. He had venison stew he'd made 2 days ago, still good, and biscuits that were only slightly stale. He heated the stew, warmed the biscuits, and brought her a bowl and plate balanced carefully in his large hands. It's not fancy, he warned. Evelyn took the bowl and inhaled the steam rising from it. It's perfect, she said, and the way she said it made Ronan think she meant more than just the food. He made himself a bowl and sat in the chair eating while she ate, both of them quiet. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the small cabin, warmed by fire and food and the strange, unexpected comfort of another human presence, the world felt suddenly less cold than it had in a very long time. When Evelyn had eaten all she could, which wasn't much, her stomach having shrunk from hunger and stress, Ronan took the bowl and helped her settle back into the blankets. She was asleep before he'd even moved away from the bed. Her face relaxed in a way it hadn't been while she was awake. Ronan stood looking down at her for a moment, this stranger who'd appeared out of the storm like something from a dream. He thought about Silas Blackwood, about a man who could look at another human being and find them wanting, who could leave someone to die in a blizzard over vanity and wounded pride. He thought about what kind of man did that, and what kind of reckoning such a man deserved. Then he shook his head, banishing those thoughts. Right now, none of that mattered. Right now, what mattered was that Evelyn Ward was alive, was safe, was sleeping in his bed while the storm screamed outside. Tomorrow would bring its own problems. Tonight, this was enough. Ronan made up a pallet on the floor near the fire, using his coat as a pillow and his spare blanket for covering. Bear immediately came and lay down beside him, pressing his warm bulk against Ronan's side. He lay there listening to the storm, to the crackle of the fire, to Evelyn's steady breathing, and he thought about how strange life was, how one random moment could change everything. 3 hours ago, he'd been alone, content in his solitude, asking nothing from the world but to be left in peace. Now there was a woman sleeping in his bed, a woman who'd brought trouble and complications and questions he had no answers for. He should be angry about it, resentful. Instead, listening to her breathe, knowing she was alive because he'd opened a door, Ronan felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt needed, useful, like his existence mattered for something beyond just surviving. It was a dangerous feeling. He knew that caring about people, needing people, letting them need you, that's where pain lived. That's where loss waited. He'd learned that lesson the hard way, had built his whole life around avoiding it. And yet here he was, already worrying about what would happen to this stranger when the storm broke, already thinking about how to protect her, already caring whether she lived or died. Damn fool, he muttered to himself, but without any real heat. Bear huffed softly, as if agreeing. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside Ronan Hale's cabin, two strangers slept, sheltered by walls built by honest hands, warmed by a fire that wouldn't let them freeze, kept safe by the miles of snow and ice that separated them from a world that had proven itself cruel. Tomorrow would bring its reckoning. Tonight, they were safe. And for now, that was everything. Morning came late to the valley, though you couldn't have proven it by the sky. The storm had finally exhausted itself sometime before dawn, leaving behind a world transformed into something alien and hostile. Snow had piled against the cabin walls in drifts that reached halfway up the windows, and everything beyond Ronan's small clearing had vanished beneath a blanket of white so complete it erased the horizon. The sun, when it finally managed to break through the clouds around mid-morning, reflected off all that snow with a brightness that hurt to look at directly. Ronan woke stiff and sore from sleeping on the floor, his back protesting as he pushed himself upright. Bear was already awake, sitting by the door with his tail wagging hopefully. The dog needed to go out, and Ronan needed to check on the horses and the few cattle that had been close enough to the barn to shelter there. But first he glanced toward the bed where Evelyn still slept, her dark hair spread across his pillow, her face peaceful in a way that made her look younger than her years. Color had returned fully to her cheeks overnight. That was good. The frostbite on her fingers and toes would heal, though she'd likely lose the tips of 2 fingers and at least 1 toe. He'd seen worse. Hell, he'd survived worse himself. He had a scar on his left hand where frostbite had taken half his pinky finger during his first winter here. You learned to be more careful after that, or you didn't survive long enough to learn anything at all. He built up the fire quietly, adding wood without waking her, then pulled on his heavy coat and boots. "Come on, Bear," he whispered, and the dog practically vibrated with excitement as Ronan opened the door just wide enough for them to slip through. The cold hit like a physical blow. The storm might have passed, but the temperature had dropped even further in its wake, and Ronan's breath formed clouds of vapor that froze in his beard almost instantly. He had to use his shoulder to force the door open against the drift that had built up overnight. And even then, he only managed to create an opening wide enough to squeeze through sideways. The world outside was silent in a way that felt unnatural after 3 days of the storm's constant roar. Nothing moved. No birds, no wind, no sound except the soft crunch of snow under his boots, and Bear's excited panting as the dog bounded through drifts that came up to his chest. The barn was barely visible 30 yards away, just a dark shape against all that white. Ronan made his way there slowly, testing each step. Snow could hide a lot, fallen branches, holes in the ground, patches of ice that could turn an ankle, or worse. He'd known men who'd frozen to death 20 feet from their own front doors because they'd fallen and couldn't get back up. Wyoming didn't forgive carelessness. The barn door was frozen shut, ice having formed in the gaps around the frame. Ronan had to kick it 3 times before it grudgingly opened, and when it did, he was hit with the warm, hay-scented smell of animals and the low nickering of horses who were very ready to be fed and watered. His 2 horses, a bay gelding named Red and a gray mare called Smoke, stood in their stalls looking indignant at having been left alone for so long. In the back, 3 cattle huddled together for warmth, their breath rising in clouds. Yeah, I know," Ronan muttered, grabbing a pitchfork. "I'm late. Sue me." He spent the next hour doing the necessary work, feeding and watering the animals, mucking out stalls, checking for injuries or signs of illness. Everything looked good. The barn had held, the animals had survived, and his small herd was intact. He'd lost stock in previous storms, come out to find cattle frozen standing up, or horses with lungs damaged from breathing air that was too cold. This time, he'd been lucky. By the time he made his way back to the cabin, the sun was higher and the glare off the snow was nearly blinding. He kicked the snow off his boots before entering and found Evelyn awake, sitting up in bed with the blankets pulled around her shoulders, staring at the door with an expression that suggested she'd been worrying. "I thought you'd left," she said, and there was something raw in her voice that made Ronan pause. "Just checking the animals," he said, stamping his feet to warm them. "The barn's 30 yards from the cabin. I wasn't leaving you." Evelyn looked down at her hands, embarrassed. "I'm sorry. I don't know why I thought. It's just that when I woke up and you were gone, She stopped, shaking her head. "Never mind. I'm being foolish." Ronan crossed to the fire and held his hands out to warm them, understanding what she wasn't saying. She'd been abandoned once already in the last 48 hours. Waking up alone had probably felt like it was happening again. "You're not foolish," he said quietly, "and I'm not going anywhere. Neither are you. Not until this weather breaks properly, and we can figure out what comes next." "How long will that be?" "Hard to say. Storms passed, but it left at least 2 feet of new snow. The trails will be impassable for days, maybe a week. And even when they clear, traveling will be dangerous." He glanced at her, taking in her pale face and the way she held her bandaged hands carefully in her lap. "You're in no condition to travel anyway. Those fingers need time to heal, and you need to regain your strength." "I don't want to impose—" "You're not imposing," Ronan said, more sharply than he'd intended. Then, softer, "You're not imposing. I've got food enough, and it's not like I had pressing social engagements planned. You stay as long as you need. That's the end of it." Evelyn studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face for something. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her because she nodded slowly. "Thank you, Mr. Hale. Truly. I don't know what I would have done if—" "Ronan," he interrupted. "Just Ronan. And you don't need to thank me for basic human decency. Though given what Blackwood did, I guess basic decency is in shorter supply than it should be." He moved to the kitchen area and started pulling out supplies. "You need to eat. Real food, not just broth. Think you can handle eggs and bacon?" "I think I could handle a bear if you cooked it," Evelyn said, and there was a hint of humor in her voice that made Ronan smile despite himself. He cooked breakfast while she watched, feeling oddly self-conscious about the domestic act. He wasn't used to anyone seeing how he lived, seeing the small routines that made up his days. But Evelyn didn't seem to judge. She just watched with quiet interest, occasionally asking questions about the cabin or the valley or how long he'd been here. When the food was ready, Ronan brought her a plate and then settled in the chair with his own. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, and Ronan found himself watching her when he thought she wasn't looking. She ate slowly but steadily, her manners suggesting education and refinement even in these rough circumstances. Everything about her spoke of a different world than this one, from the way she held her fork to the precise way she wiped her mouth with the cloth he'd given her. "Tell me about Boston," he said finally. "What made you leave?" Evelyn set down her fork and was quiet for a moment. "My father was a professor at Harvard," she said finally. "Literature and philosophy. We lived in a nice house near the university, had servants, knew the right people. I grew up thinking the world was books and discussions and ideas. Then my father died 3 years ago, and I discovered that all those ideas didn't translate into anything practical like money or property. He'd been living beyond his means for years, spending everything on books and maintaining appearances. When he died, there was nothing left except debt." She picked up her fork again, pushing food around her plate without eating it. "My mother had died when I was young, and I had no siblings, no family to turn to. The house was sold to pay creditors, and I was left with 2 trunks of clothes and an education that qualified me for absolutely nothing useful. I tried teaching, but the good schools wanted references I didn't have, and the bad schools paid wages you couldn't survive on. I tried being a governess, but I was too young and too educated, made the mothers nervous. Finally, I found work as a seamstress in a shop that made custom dresses for wealthy women." That doesn't sound so bad, Ronan offered. Evelyn laughed, but it was a bitter sound. 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, bent over a needle in bad light. My fingers bled constantly. The other girls were kind, but they'd grown up poor and hard. They thought I was putting on airs when I used words they didn't know or mentioned books I'd read. And the pay, she shook her head, $7 a week, and half of that went to rent for a room I shared with 2 other girls. I was slowly starving, and I knew it. I could see my future stretched out before me, years of gray life growing old and bent, dying in that cramped room with nothing to show for my existence except a lot of perfect stitches. She met his eyes then, and he saw the steel beneath her refined surface. So when I saw Mr. Blackwood's advertisement in the paper, it felt like a lifeline. He wanted an educated woman, someone who could read and discuss books, someone refined. He painted a picture of a life out west that sounded like adventure, like purpose. A partnership, he called it, a meeting of minds as well as a marriage. I thought... She stopped, swallowing hard. I thought maybe I'd found a way to have both survival and something approaching happiness. I was so desperate to believe in that possibility that I ignored every warning sign. What warning signs? Ronan asked quietly. His letters were wrong, Evelyn said. They were too perfect, too polished. I thought at the time that he must be well educated, cultured, but looking back, I think someone else wrote them for him. The man who met me at the station, who looked at me like I was a disappointing horse he'd been talked into buying, that man couldn't have written those letters. He could barely string together a sentence without cursing or spitting. The man in the letters was thoughtful, philosophical. The real Silas Blackwood was... She searched for words. Crude, mean, small, despite all his money and land. Ronan felt that cold anger settling in his chest again, the same anger he'd felt when she first told her story. He had no right to leave you like that. Contract or no contract, you don't abandon someone to die. That's murder, near enough. But who would believe that? Evelyn asked. A wealthy, respected rancher versus a desperate mail-order bride. He gave me $10, which he'll claim was fair payment for travel costs. He'll say he offered to take me back to town, and I refused. Or he'll say I was unstable, unsuitable, a liar. Who's going to take my word over his? I will, Ronan said flatly. And I'm not nobody in this valley. I've been here 7 years, built my place with my own hands, never caused trouble or owed debts. People know me. People trust me. If I say Silas Blackwood left you to die in a blizzard, some folks will listen. And the rest will say you're a lonely bachelor taken in by a scheming woman, Evelyn said sadly. That I bewitched you somehow, got my hooks in you. They'll say I'm trying to ruin a good man's reputation because my own plans fell through. That's how these things work, Ronan. The powerful stay powerful because they control the story. Ronan wanted to argue, but he couldn't. She was right. He'd seen it before, the way money and influence could reshape reality to suit the powerful. He'd seen it in the war, where generals' mistakes got rewritten as strategies and common soldiers' sacrifices got forgotten entirely. He'd seen it here in Wyoming, where big ranchers pushed out smaller homesteaders through force and intimidation and then claimed they'd bought the land fair and square. So what do you want to do? He asked. Evelyn was quiet for a long time, staring at the fire. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady and clear. I want to survive. I want to figure out how to live here, in this place, without having to depend on anyone's mercy or charity. I want to become someone who can't be discarded or dismissed. I don't know how to do that yet, but I know I'm not going back to Boston with my tail between my legs. I came west looking for a new life. The fact that it didn't come in the package I expected doesn't change that I still need it. Ronan nodded slowly. Then we'll figure it out. But first, you heal. And while you're healing, you can help me around here. Not because you owe me, he added quickly, seeing her expression, but because it'll give you something to do besides worry and because I could use the help. Place this small, there's always work that needs doing. I don't know anything about ranching or farming, Evelyn warned. I can barely tell one end of a horse from another. Neither could I when I started, Ronan said. You learn or you die. It's a powerful motivator. He stood and collected their empty plates. For now, you should rest more. Your body's been through hell, and recovery takes time. I've got to dig out the paths to the barn and the woodpile, which will take most of the day. You sleep, and tonight I'll start teaching you about life out here. Deal?" Evelyn smiled, and it was the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. It transformed her face completely, made her beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with features and everything to do with spirit. "Deal," she said. Ronan grabbed his coat and headed back outside, trying not to think too hard about that smile or the way it had made something warm unfold in his chest. He had work to do, practical work that required his attention. He couldn't afford to be distracted by a woman's smile, no matter how pretty it was. But as he shoveled snow for the next several hours, creating paths and clearing drifts, he found his mind wandering back to the cabin, to Evelyn sitting by the fire. He found himself thinking about her story, about a woman educated and refined, brought low by circumstances, fighting to survive in a world that had no place for her. He thought about her courage in answering that advertisement, in traveling across the country alone to meet a stranger. He thought about her strength in walking through a blizzard when most people would have just lain down and died. And he thought about how the cabin had felt different this morning, warmer somehow, fuller. For 7 years it had been perfectly adequate, a shelter, a place to sleep and eat and wait out the winters. But having Evelyn there, hearing another voice, seeing another face across the table, it had reminded him of something he'd forgotten. It had reminded him that human beings weren't meant to be alone, that connection and companionship weren't weaknesses to be avoided but needs as fundamental as food and water. The realization unsettled him. He'd built his life around solitude, convinced himself it was what he wanted. Now, after less than 24 hours of sharing his space with a stranger, he was already questioning those choices. That was dangerous. That was how you got hurt. Bear bounded through the snow nearby, chasing some scent only he could detect, and Ronan envied the dog's simplicity. Bear didn't worry about the future or question the past. He just lived, moment to moment, content with warm places to sleep and regular meals and the occasional pat on the head. "Must be nice," Ronan muttered, "being a dog." By the time Ronan returned to the cabin, shadows were lengthening across the snow and he was exhausted. His shoulders ached from shoveling, his fingers were numb despite his gloves, and his beard was crusted with ice from his frozen breath. He stamped snow off his boots and pushed through the door and stopped short at what he found inside. The cabin was transformed. Evelyn had clearly not spent the day resting as he'd told her to. The floor had been swept clean, his scattered possessions organized and arranged with care. His spare shirt and pants had been washed and hung to dry near the fire. The bed was neatly made with military precision, and something was cooking in a pot over the fire that smelled absolutely incredible, rich and savory, with herbs he didn't even know he had. Evelyn stood by the fireplace stirring the pot, wearing the dress she'd arrived in, which she'd somehow managed to repair despite its torn condition. She'd sewn up the rips with tiny, almost invisible stitches, and though the dress would never be what it once was, it was at least wearable now. Her hair was braided and pinned up, and she looked almost normal except for the bandages still wrapped around her damaged fingers. "What did I tell you about resting?" Ronan asked, but there was no heat in his voice. Evelyn turned and smiled at him, that same transformative smile from the morning. "I rested for 2 hours, then got bored and decided to make myself useful. I hope you don't mind. I found vegetables in your cellar and dried herbs on the shelf, and I thought I'd make a proper stew. The one you made was good, but it was missing. Well, everything except meat and water." Ronan laughed despite himself. "Fair point. I'm not much of a cook." "I noticed. You also weren't much of a housekeeper, if you don't mind me saying so." She gestured at the transformed cabin. "When was the last time you swept?" "Spring, maybe?" Ronan offered, and she rolled her eyes. "Men?" she said, but fondly. "Sit down. This is almost ready, and you look half frozen." Ronan obeyed, settling into the chair she'd somehow made more comfortable by adding a folded blanket as a cushion. He watched her move around the small kitchen area with surprising confidence, given how unfamiliar the space must be to her. She ladled stew into 2 bowls, cut thick slices from the bread she'd somehow baked while he was outside, and brought everything to the table with an efficiency that spoke of practice. When he tasted the stew, Ronan actually groaned. It was rich and complex, the meat tender, the vegetables perfectly cooked, the broth flavored with herbs and something else he couldn't identify, but which made the whole thing sing. It was, without exaggeration, the best thing he'd eaten in 7 years. How? He asked between bites. How did you make this with the basic supplies I had? Evelyn shrugged. When you work 14 hours a day for $7 a week, you learn to make meals from scraps. The other seamstresses taught me. One girl, Mary, her mother had been a cook in a big house before times got hard. She knew things, how to make tough meat tender, how to stretch a penny's worth of vegetables into a meal for 5, how to use herbs to make plain food taste like something. I learned from her. She paused, her expression growing sad. Mary died last year, consumption. She was 19. They ate in silence for a while, but it was a comfortable silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the soft sound of spoons against bowls. Ronan found himself watching Evelyn again, noticing the small things, the way she ate slowly, savoring each bite, the way she sat with perfect posture even though she must have been exhausted from cooking and cleaning all day with damaged hands, the way she occasionally glanced around the cabin as if still not quite believing she was safe. Tell me about this place, she said finally. How did you end up here? What made you choose Wyoming territory over anywhere else? Ronan set down his spoon, considering how much to tell her. He wasn't used to talking about himself, wasn't comfortable with the vulnerability it required, but she'd been honest with him about her past, about Boston and the choices that had brought her here. He owed her the same honesty. I came west after the war, he said finally. Gettysburg, Chancellorsville, all of it. I was in the 4th Pennsylvania Infantry, saw more death in 3 years than any person should see in a lifetime. My brother died at Gettysburg, and something in me died with him. When the war ended, I tried going home, but home didn't fit anymore. Or maybe I didn't fit home, I'm not sure which. Everything felt wrong. Too close, too crowded, too full of people who wanted to talk about the war or wanted me to forget the war, neither of which I could do. He paused, staring into his bowl. There was a girl, Sarah. We'd talked about marriage before I enlisted, had this whole future planned out. When I came back, she was still there, still waiting, still wanted that future. But I couldn't give it to her. Couldn't be the man she'd waited for. Couldn't pretend I was okay when I wasn't. Couldn't imagine settling into that quiet life when my head was still full of screaming and thunder. So I left, told her she deserved better than a broken soldier, packed what I could carry, and headed west. Did she try to stop you? Evelyn asked softly. Yes, Ronan said. She cried, said she didn't care if I was different, said we could figure it out together. But I was 24 and convinced I was doing the noble thing by leaving her free to find someone whole. Looking back, I'm not sure it was noble or just cowardice. Either way, I left. He took a breath and continued. I drifted for a while, worked cattle drives, did some mining, tried my hand at various things, eventually made my way up here to Wyoming territory, and something about it felt right. The space, the quiet, the way you could ride for hours without seeing another soul. I found this valley, this particular spot, and thought maybe I could build something here. Something simple and clean that didn't require me to be anything other than what I was. So I filed a homestead claim, built this cabin, started a small herd. 7 years later, here I am. Alone, Evelyn said, and it wasn't a question. Alone, Ronan confirmed. By choice, mostly. The other ranchers in the valley, there's 4 or 5 of us scattered around, plus Blackwood's big operation. They're friendly enough when we cross paths in town, but we all keep to ourselves mostly. That's how it works out here. You help when help's needed, but you don't intrude otherwise. Evelyn was quiet for a moment, then said, That sounds lonely. It is, Ronan admitted, surprising himself with the honesty. But lonely felt safer than the alternative. You can't lose what you don't have, can't disappoint people who aren't there, can't fail at relationships you never start. He looked up and met her eyes. Sounds foolish when I say it out loud. It sounds like survival, Evelyn said. I understand survival. I understand doing what you have to do to protect yourself from more pain. But Ronan, she hesitated, then continued, you can't live your whole life in fear of loss. That's not living. That's just existing. Waiting to die without ever really being alive. Says the woman who came all the way to Wyoming to marry a stranger, Ronan pointed out. Exactly, Evelyn said firmly. I took a risk. A huge, terrifying risk. And yes, it went catastrophically wrong, but at least I tried. At least I reached for something more than just safe existence. And I'll try again somehow, because the alternative is going back to slowly dying in a cramped room in Boston, and I can't accept that. Won't accept it. They looked at each other across the table, and something passed between them. Understanding, perhaps, or recognition. Two people who'd been broken by life in different ways, who'd chosen different paths to protect themselves, but who both understood what it meant to hurt, to survive, to keep going even when going seemed impossible. "You're braver than me," Ronan said quietly. "No," Evelyn countered. "I'm just more desperate. Desperation looks like bravery sometimes, but it's really just lack of options." She stood and began collecting the dishes. "But maybe together we can figure out how to be actually brave instead of just desperate. Maybe that's why the storm brought me here, not to be rescued, but to learn how to rescue myself. And maybe to teach you something in the process." "Teach me what?" "That being alone isn't the same as being safe. That walls built to keep pain out also keep life out. That you can't heal by yourself, you need other people, whether you want to or not." She smiled at him over her shoulder. "Consider it payment for room and board. You save my life, I save yours. Fair trade." Ronan wanted to argue, wanted to say his life didn't need saving, but he couldn't quite make the words come. Because maybe she was right. Maybe he had been just existing, not living. Maybe 7 years of solitude had been protection, but also prison. Maybe this stranger in his cabin, this woman who'd appeared out of a blizzard like an answer to a question he hadn't known he was asking, maybe she could see things he'd blinded himself to. "Fair trade," he agreed finally, and her smile widened. The next few days fell into an unexpected rhythm. Each morning, Ronan woke early and did the necessary outdoor work, feeding animals, checking fences, cutting more firewood. Each evening, he returned to find the cabin warmer and more welcoming than it had been the day before, with Evelyn cooking meals that actually tasted like food instead of just fuel. They ate together, talked together, and slowly learned each other's patterns and habits. Evelyn proved to be quick study when Ronan began teaching her about life on a ranch. She learned how to milk the cow he'd kept in the barn, how to collect eggs from the chickens, how to mend harness leather and card wool from last year's shearing. Her damaged fingers made the work difficult, but she never complained, just adapted her grip and kept trying until she got it right. In return, she transformed his bachelor existence. She mended clothes he'd worn ragged, organized his chaotic collection of supplies and tools, even cleaned his rifle and showed him she knew how to load and fire it, a skill her father had taught her, apparently, during summers at a cousin's farm. She taught him small domestic tricks he'd never known, ways to make coffee taste better, how to keep bread fresh longer, why you salted meat a certain way for preservation. They talked constantly during these domestic chores. She told him about books she'd read, ideas she'd encountered in her father's university world, stories about Boston and the life she'd left behind. He told her about the war in ways he'd never told anyone, finding that she listened without judgment or platitudes. He told her about Wyoming, about the valley's history and the people who'd settled here, about the harsh beauty of the land and the price it demanded from those who tried to tame it. And slowly, carefully, they became friends. On the 5th day after the storm, Evelyn stood at the window looking out at the snow-covered valley, her expression thoughtful. "What are you thinking?" Ronan asked from his chair, where he was oiling a saddle. "That I can't stay here forever," she said quietly. "That eventually I'll have to face the world beyond this cabin. Face Stone Creek, face the possibility of running into Silas Blackwood, face the question of what comes next for me." Ronan's hand stilled on the leather. "You could stay," he heard himself say. "Not forever maybe, but longer. Until spring, at least. You could help me with the ranch, learn the work, and when the weather breaks properly, you'd be in a better position to make decisions. You'd have skills, references from me, money saved if I pay you a fair wage for the work." Evelyn turned from the window, surprise clear on her face. "You do that? Pay me to stay and help? Why not? I could use the help and you need time to figure things out. Makes sense." He tried to keep his voice casual, tried not to let her see how much he wanted her to say yes, how much he'd come to depend on her presence in just a few short days. She studied his face for a long moment, and he had the uncomfortable feeling she could see right through his casual tone to the loneliness underneath. But when she spoke, her voice was gentle. "I'd like that. Thank you, Ronan." He nodded and went back to oiling the saddle, not trusting himself to speak. Outside, the sun was setting over the snow-covered valley, painting everything in shades of gold and pink. Inside the cabin, firelight flickered across walls that had known only one occupant for 7 years, but now held two, and the silence between them was warm and comfortable. Neither of them said what they were both thinking, that this arrangement couldn't last forever, that eventually the valley would thaw and reality would intrude, that Silas Blackwood wouldn't simply forget about the mail-order bride who disappeared into a blizzard. But for now, in this moment, they were safe and warm and not alone. And for now, that was enough. The days that followed blurred together in a pattern that felt both strange and natural. Each morning brought the same routines. Ronan rising before dawn to tend the animals, Evelyn waking shortly after to start breakfast and tackle whatever domestic projects she'd set for herself the day before. The cabin became a small world unto itself, sealed off from the valley by snow that still measured 3 feet deep in places, protected from the questions and complications of the outside world by simple geography and weather that refused to fully break. But within that small world, something was shifting. Ronan felt it in the way he found himself hurrying through his outdoor chores, eager to get back inside where Evelyn's voice and laughter waited. He felt it in the way his chest tightened when he came through the door and saw her there, bent over some task, humming softly to herself. He felt it most acutely in the evenings when they sat by the fire, talking until the logs burned low and the only light came from embers, and he realized he'd been staring at her face instead of listening to her words. This was dangerous territory. He knew it intellectually, could list all the reasons why getting attached to Evelyn Ward was a mistake waiting to happen. She was vulnerable, dependent on him for survival. She'd nearly died days ago and was still recovering. She'd come here planning to marry another man and had no reason to want anything from Ronan except temporary shelter. And perhaps most importantly, she deserved better than a broken-down former soldier who'd spent 7 years hiding from the world in a cabin at the edge of nowhere. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally were two different things, and Ronan's heart seemed determined to ignore every logical argument his mind constructed. When Evelyn laughed at something he said, he felt 10 feet tall. When she asked his opinion on things, books, ideas, plans for improving the cabin, he felt valued in a way he hadn't since before the war. And when she smiled at him across the table, her dark eyes warm in the firelight, he felt something that terrified him more than any blizzard or threat of violence. He felt hope. It was the 10th day after the storm when everything began to change. Ronan had been checking the southern fence line, looking for damage from the heavy snow, when he noticed tracks in a clearing about half a mile from his property. Fresh tracks, made within the last few hours. Horse tracks, multiple animals, moving in a pattern that suggested they were searching for something rather than just passing through. Ronan knelt beside the tracks, his jaw tightening. He knew these tracks. He'd seen them before in town, distinctive because one of the horses had a shoe with a broken nail that left a telltale mark in snow or mud. These were Silas Blackwood's horses, which meant Blackwood's men were out here, searching. And there was only one thing they could be searching for: Evelyn. Ronan stood and looked back toward his cabin, hidden by trees and distance, but suddenly feeling terribly exposed. He'd known this moment would come eventually, known that Blackwood wouldn't just let things lie. But he'd hoped for more time, hoped the weather and isolation would keep them safe longer. That hope had apparently been naive. He made his way back to the cabin quickly, his mind racing. When he pushed through the door, Evelyn looked up from where she'd been kneading bread dough, and whatever she saw in his face made her own expression shift to concern. "What's wrong?" "Blackwood's men are searching the valley," Ronan said, shrugging out of his coat. "Found their tracks about half a mile south of here. They're looking for you." Evelyn's hands stilled in the dough. "How do you know they're looking for me? Maybe they're not just doing anything," Ronan interrupted. "Blackwood owns the land to the east and south. He's got no reason to have men out searching near my property unless he's looking for something specific, and the timing's too convenient to be coincidence. The trails have been clear enough for travel for 3 days now. He's finally gotten around to checking whether you survived that storm." "Why would he care?" Evelyn asked, but her voice was uncertain. "He left me to die. Why would he come looking now?" Ronan poured himself coffee, needing something to do with his hands. Could be he's worried about witnesses. Could be someone saw his foreman drop you off and asked questions. Could be he's just tying up loose ends, making sure there's no evidence of what he did. Or maybe, he paused, considering, maybe he's heard rumors that you survived and wants to control the story before you can tell your side. Evelyn wiped flour from her hands and came to stand beside him at the window, looking out at the snowy valley. "What do we do?" The "we" in that question made something warm settle in Ronan's chest despite the circumstances. She wasn't assuming he'd hand her over or make her face this alone. She was including him in her plans, treating them as a unit. It was a small word, but it carried weight. "We have options," Ronan said. "I can hide you if they come here. There's a root cellar that's not obvious, and they've got no legal right to search my property without cause. Or you can stay visible and we tell them the truth, that you nearly died, that I took you in, and that you're working for me now as a hired hand. That's all legal and proper. Nothing Blackwood can object to without revealing his own actions." "But if we tell them I'm here, won't that put you in danger?" Evelyn asked. "If Blackwood is worried about witnesses or trying to cover up what he did, having you know the truth makes you a problem too." "I can handle Silas Blackwood," Ronan said with more confidence than he felt. "He's used to pushing around people who can't push back. Homesteaders who owe him money, small ranchers who need his goodwill to survive. But I don't owe him anything, and my land is clear and paid for. He can threaten all he wants, but he's got no leverage over me." Evelyn turned to look at him directly. "You're sure about this? About standing up to the most powerful man in the valley for someone you've known less than 2 weeks?" Ronan met her eyes, and the words came easier than he'd expected. "I'm sure. What he did to you was wrong, Evelyn. Criminal, if we could prove it in a way that would matter to a court. I'm not going to let him intimidate you into silence or disappearing just to protect his reputation. And I'm not going to let him hurt you again in any way. That's a promise." Something shifted in Evelyn's expression, something soft and complicated that made Ronan's breath catch. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers, bandaged still but healing, curling around his calloused palm. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything you've done, everything you've risked. I don't have words for how much it means." Ronan squeezed her hand gently, acutely aware of how small it felt in his, how fragile she'd been when she'd collapsed at his door, and how strong she'd proven herself to be since. "You don't need words," he said. "You being alive is thanks enough." They stood like that for a moment, hands linked, looking at each other across a distance that felt simultaneously too far and too close. Then Bear barked sharply from outside, and they both jumped, the moment shattering. "Someone's coming," Ronan said, dropping her hand and moving to the window. Sure enough, 2 riders were approaching from the south, picking their way carefully through the snow. Even at a distance, Ronan recognized the man in front, Silas Blackwood himself, sitting tall in the saddle like he owned everything he surveyed. The second rider was younger, probably his foreman, the same one who'd abandoned Evelyn at the fork in the road. "It's him," Evelyn breathed, and Ronan heard the fear in her voice. "Ronan, I don't think I can face him." "You don't have to," Ronan said firmly. "Stay inside. I'll handle this. Lock the door behind me and don't open it unless I tell you to." "But trust me," Ronan said, pulling on his coat. He checked his rifle, loaded as always, and slung it over his shoulder in a casual carry that still communicated readiness. "I've dealt with men like Blackwood before. They're all bluster until someone stands up to them. Just stay inside and stay quiet." Evelyn nodded, her face pale but determined. As Ronan opened the door and stepped out, he heard the bolt slide home behind him, locking her safely inside. Good. Whatever happened next, he wanted her protected. Ronan walked out to meet the riders, positioning himself between them and his cabin, one hand resting casually near his rifle. Bear trotted at his heels, growling low. The dog didn't like these visitors, and Ronan trusted the animal's instincts. Silas Blackwood reined in his horse about 10 yards away, his foreman stopping beside him. Up close, Blackwood was exactly what Ronan had expected, a large man running to fat, with a florid face and small, calculating eyes. He wore expensive clothes that looked ridiculous out here in the snow, more suited to a city drawing room than a Wyoming ranch. Everything about him screamed money and the arrogance that came with it. "Ronan Hale," Blackwood said, his voice carrying the false heartiness of someone who thought charm could buy anything. "Good to see you. We've met a few times in town, though I don't think we've had the pleasure of a real conversation." "Mr. Blackwood," Ronan said neutrally, "what brings you out to my property?" "Just checking on my neighbors after that terrible storm," Blackwood said smoothly. "Making sure everyone came through all right. Lost some cattle myself, and I heard old Peterson's barn collapsed. Tragic business, winter storms." "I came through fine," Ronan said. "Everything's intact here. Appreciate the concern, but as you can see, I'm managing well enough." Blackwood smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm sure you are. You've always been a capable man, from what I hear. Self-sufficient. That's admirable." He paused, then added with studied casualness, "I don't suppose you've seen anyone unusual in the valley. Travelers, maybe, caught out by the storm?" There it was, the real reason for the visit, dressed up in neighborly concern but transparent as glass. Ronan kept his face carefully neutral. "Why do you ask?" "Oh, just curious," Blackwood said. "I was supposed to meet someone off the train the day the storm hit, but there was some confusion, and we never connected. I've been worried about what might have happened to them in that weather. A woman, traveling alone. You can imagine my concern." Ronan could feel Evelyn listening from inside the cabin, could almost sense her fear through the walls. He kept his voice level and calm. "You left a woman out in that storm? That seems careless." Blackwood's smile tightened slightly. "There was a misunderstanding. My foreman here thought I'd wanted her taken back to town, when I'd actually meant for her to be brought directly to the ranch. By the time we realized the error, the storm had gotten too bad to search safely. Now that the weather's cleared, I'm trying to locate her, make sure she's all right. She is, after all, my responsibility." It was a smooth lie, delivered with practiced ease. If Ronan hadn't heard the truth from Evelyn herself, he might have believed it, might have sympathized with this wealthy rancher worried about a woman under his care. But he had heard the truth, and he knew exactly what kind of man Silas Blackwood was. "Seems like a woman alone in that storm wouldn't have made it far," Ronan observed. "If she was headed to town from the Fork, that's a 5-mile walk. No one survives 5 miles in a blizzard like that one." "Perhaps," Blackwood agreed, but his eyes had gone hard. "But I'd still like to be certain. You'd tell me if you'd seen anyone, wouldn't you, Hale? If someone had ended up on your property." "Depends," Ronan said, "on whether they wanted to be found." The false heartiness dropped from Blackwood's expression like a mask removed. "Excuse me?" "I said it depends on whether they wanted to be found," Ronan repeated calmly. "See, the way I understand it, if someone came to my property seeking shelter, I'd have a responsibility to protect them. That's how hospitality works out here. Someone asks for help, you give it. You don't hand them over to whoever comes asking questions later." Blackwood's face was darkening, his small eyes narrowing. "Are you saying you're harboring someone on your property, Hale?" "I'm saying that if I were, it would be my business and theirs, not yours," Ronan replied. "Unless you've got some legal claim that says otherwise." "She signed a contract with me," Blackwood snapped, his temper finally showing through. "She agreed to marry me, to become my wife. That gives me certain rights." "A contract that you dissolved," said a voice from behind Ronan, clear and steady. "In writing, with a $10 payment to make it official." Ronan's heart sank, even as part of him swelled with pride. Evelyn had opened the door and stepped out onto the porch, the letter Blackwood had given her held in her hand. She'd ignored his instruction to stay hidden, had chosen to face her tormentor directly rather than hide behind locked doors. It was brave and foolish and absolutely like her. Blackwood's expression went through several rapid changes: shock, anger, calculation, and finally a twisted satisfaction that made Ronan's hand tighten on his rifle. "Miss Ward," Blackwood said. "Thank God. We've been so worried about you. When the storm hit and we realized you were out in it, I sent men searching as soon as the weather allowed. You must have been terrified." "I was," Evelyn said, and her voice was cold as the snow around them. terrified and freezing to death because you left me on that road to die. Your foreman didn't make a mistake, Mr. Blackwood. You told him to abandon me there. You looked me in the eyes and told me I wasn't what you'd ordered, as if I were merchandise instead of a person. Then you rode away and left me to freeze." "That's a lie," Blackwood said, but there was something desperate in his voice now. "You're confused, traumatized by your experience. It's understandable, but you're misremembering what happened. I never meant—" "I have your letter," Evelyn interrupted, holding it up. "The one you gave me dissolving our agreement. The one where you called me unsuitable and said the $10 was more than fair compensation for the inconvenience. Your own words, Mr. Blackwood, in your own handwriting. Would you like me to read it aloud?" Blackwood's face had gone from florid to nearly purple. His foreman looked uncomfortable, shifting in his saddle. Ronan watched both men carefully, his hand still near his rifle, ready for whatever came next. "Give me that letter," Blackwood demanded. "It's private correspondence. You have no right to keep it." "It's evidence," Evelyn said. "Evidence of attempted murder. Because that's what you did, Mr. Blackwood. You left me to die in a blizzard, knowing I had no survival skills, no proper clothing, no shelter. You knew exactly what would happen to me, and you did it anyway. That's not a mistake or a misunderstanding. That's deliberate." "No one will believe you," Blackwood spat, his pretense of concern completely abandoned now. "A desperate mail-order bride with no prospects against a respected rancher? You're nobody, girl, you're nothing. Whatever story you think you can tell, I can tell a better one. I'll say you're a liar, a schemer, that you tried to extort money from me, and when I refused, you invented this whole tale. Who do you think the sheriff will believe?" "He'll believe me," Ronan said quietly. "And I'm not nobody." Blackwood turned his glare on Ronan. "You're harboring her, then? Hiding her from me?" "I'm giving shelter to someone who nearly died on my doorstep," Ronan corrected, "which is what any decent human being would do. And now that she's recovered, she's working for me as a hired hand. All legal and proper. You've got no claim on her, Blackwood. You dissolved your own contract, paid her off, and sent her away. That means she's free to work for whoever she wants. And right now, that's me." "You're making a mistake, Hale," Blackwood said, his voice dropping to something threatening. "You're new money in this valley, nobody important. I've been here for 20 years. I know everyone, control half the businesses, and I can make life very difficult for people who cross me. Very difficult." "Is that a threat?" Ronan asked, his voice dangerously soft. "It's a promise," Blackwood said. "You want to protect this girl? Fine. But you'll pay for it. I'll make sure you do. Every supplier in 3 counties will refuse to sell to you. Every neighbor will think twice about helping you. By the time I'm done, you'll be begging me to take her off your hands." Ronan took a step forward, and something in his movement made Blackwood's horse sidestep nervously. "Let me make you a promise, Blackwood. You try to hurt her, try to hurt me, try to use your money and influence to make our lives difficult, and I will make sure everyone in Wyoming territory knows exactly what you did. I'll tell your story in every saloon, every store, every church from here to Cheyenne. I'll make sure everyone knows that Silas Blackwood is the kind of man who leaves women to die in blizzards. See how your reputation survives that." "That's slander," Blackwood snarled. "I'll sue you for every penny you have." "Truth is a defense against slander," Evelyn said from the porch. "And I have your letter, your own written words proving what you did. Take us to court, Mr. Blackwood, please. Let a judge read your letter in open court. Let everyone hear how you describe me as unsuitable merchandise. Let the whole territory know what kind of man you really are." For a long moment, silence hung over the clearing. Blackwood sat on his horse, his face twisted with rage and something that might have been fear. His foreman wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. Bear growled low, and a crow called somewhere in the distance, harsh and mocking. Finally, Blackwood jerked his horse's reins, yanking the animal's head around. "This isn't over," he said. "Not by a long shot. You think you've won something here, but all you've done is make an enemy you can't afford to have. Both of you will regret this. I promise you that." He kicked his horse into motion, and the foreman followed quickly, both men disappearing back the way they'd come, leaving deep tracks in the snow. Ronan and Evelyn stood watching until they'd vanished completely into the trees, and only then did Ronan lower his hand from his rifle. "That went well," Evelyn said, and there was a hysterical edge to her laugh. You were supposed to stay inside, Ronan said, turning to face her. I told you to stay hidden. I know, Evelyn said, but I couldn't. I couldn't hide while you fought my battle for me. And I needed to face him, needed to see that he's just a man, not the monster he seemed in my head. A cruel, small man with more money than character, but just a man nonetheless. Ronan climbed the porch steps until he stood directly in front of her. He's a dangerous man, Evelyn. You heard his threats? He meant them. He's going to try to make both our lives hell now. I know, Evelyn said. And I'm sorry. I've brought this trouble to your door, put you in danger because of my choices. If you want me to leave, I'd understand. I could take the train to Cheyenne, start over somewhere Blackwood can't reach me. No, Ronan said, and the force of the word surprised him. You're not leaving. I'm not letting him drive you away, and I'm not letting you face this alone. We're in this together now. Evelyn's eyes searched his face. Why? She asked softly. Why risk everything for me? You've built a life here, established yourself. I'm asking you to throw all that away for someone you barely know. Ronan realized he was standing very close to her, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes, close enough to smell the scent of bread dough and wood smoke that clung to her dress. His hand moved almost without his conscious decision, reaching up to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. Because you're worth it, he said simply. Because what he did was wrong, and someone needs to stand up to men like him. Because in 10 days you've reminded me what it feels like to be alive instead of just existing. Because... He stopped, the next words catching in his throat. Because... Why? Evelyn prompted, her voice barely above a whisper. Because I care about you, Ronan said, and the admission felt like jumping off a cliff. More than I should, more than makes sense. But there it is. I care what happens to you. I care whether you're safe and happy and alive. And I'm not going to let Silas Blackwood or anyone else hurt you if I can prevent it. Evelyn's breath caught. Ronan, you don't have to say anything, he said quickly, stepping back, putting safe distance between them again. I'm not asking for anything. I just want you to know why I'm willing to stand against Blackwood. It's not charity or obligation. It's, I care about you too, Evelyn interrupted. That's what I was trying to say. I care about you, Ronan Hale, and it terrifies me because I've only known you 10 days, and it's too soon and too fast, and I don't trust my own judgment after the disaster with Blackwood. But I can't help it. You saved my life, yes, but more than that, you've treated me like a person, like someone who matters. You've listened to me, taught me, trusted me. You've given me back my dignity when Blackwood tried to take it away. How could I not care about someone who's done all that? They stared at each other, both breathing hard, the air between them electric with things unspoken. Ronan wanted to close the distance again, wanted to pull her into his arms and kiss her, and damn the consequences. But he held himself still, knowing it was too soon, too complicated, that she needed time and space to sort through everything that had happened. We should go inside, he said finally, his voice rough. It's cold out here, and we need to talk about what comes next. Blackwood's not going to let this drop. Evelyn nodded, though something like disappointment flickered across her face. You're right, we need a plan. They went inside and Ronan built up the fire while Evelyn made coffee. They sat at the table, not quite looking at each other, both hyper-aware of what they just admitted and what it might mean. Outside, the sun climbed higher in the sky, melting snow from the roof in steady drips. The valley sparkled under its white blanket, beautiful and treacherous, hiding dangers beneath pristine surfaces. He'll try to isolate us, Ronan said finally, pulling his mind back to practical matters. Cut off our supplies, turn people against us, make it impossible to survive here. That's how men like Blackwood operate. They use economic pressure because it's legal and hard to fight. Can he really do that? Evelyn asked. Control who sells to us? Maybe, Ronan admitted. He's got influence in Stone Creek, owns shares in several businesses, but there are other towns, other suppliers, and I've got some money saved, enough to last through spring if I'm careful. By then, maybe his anger will have cooled, or maybe we'll have figured out a different solution. What if we went to the sheriff? Evelyn suggested. Showed him the letter, told him what happened. Ronan shook his head. Sheriff Palmer owes his position to the big ranchers, Blackwood included. He's not going to move against someone that powerful based on one woman's word and a letter that could be interpreted different ways. We need more than that. We need leverage. What kind of leverage? I don't know yet, Ronan said, but there has to be something. Men like Blackwood don't get that powerful without making enemies, without having secrets they'd rather keep hidden. We just need to find the right pressure point. They talked for hours, planning and strategizing, trying to think 3 steps ahead of a man who'd spent 20 years learning how to get what he wanted. It was exhausting and frightening, but also oddly energizing. They were in this together now, partners against a common threat. There was strength in that, comfort in not being alone. As the afternoon wore into evening, Evelyn stood and stretched. I need to do something with my hands, she said, something normal and domestic. I'm going to finish that bread I was making before Blackwood showed up. Ronan watched her move to the counter, watched her hands work the dough with practiced efficiency, despite the bandages still wrapping her damaged fingers. She'd come so far in just 10 days, from a half-frozen woman collapsed at his door to someone strong and capable, someone who could face down the man who'd tried to kill her and not break. He'd helped save her life, yes, but she'd saved herself in all the ways that mattered. She'd refused to be defeated, refused to disappear or stay silent. She'd found her strength and claimed it. You're staring, Evelyn said without turning around, but he could hear the smile in her voice. Sorry, Ronan said, though he wasn't. Just thinking. About what? About how beautiful you are when you're being brave, he thought. About how this cabin feels like home now instead of just shelter. About how I spent 7 years convinced I was better off alone, and now I can't imagine going back to that emptiness. About how I'm glad you knocked on my door that night, he said aloud. Even with all the complications and threats, I'm glad you're here. Evelyn turned then, her hands dusted with flour, her eyes bright. Me too, she said softly. Despite everything, despite Blackwood and the uncertainty and not knowing what happens next, I'm glad I ended up here. With you. In this cabin that you built with honest hands. The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning beyond their simple surface. Outside, the light was fading toward evening, painting the snow in shades of blue and purple. Inside, the fire crackled and warmth wrapped around them like a blanket. In that moment, with danger waiting just beyond their walls and the future uncertain and frightening, they were safe. They were together, and somehow, impossibly, they were happy. Neither of them acknowledged the truth that was becoming impossible to ignore, that what had started as rescue and gratitude was becoming something deeper, something that felt dangerously like love. Neither of them spoke about what might happen when spring came and choices had to be made. They simply existed in that moment, in that space. 2 people who'd found each other through accident and storm and were now bound together by something stronger than either had expected. The bread baked, filling the cabin with its warm yeast smell. They ate dinner and talked about small things, carefully avoiding the bigger questions that loomed. And when the night grew late and it was time to sleep, Ronan made up his pallet on the floor as always, and Evelyn climbed into the bed as always, and they said goodnight as always. But the air between them hummed with possibility, with words unsaid and feelings acknowledged but not yet fully explored. Tomorrow would bring its challenges. Blackwood would make good on his threats, and they'd have to find ways to counter him. But tonight, in this cabin at the edge of the valley, 2 people slept and dreamed of futures that might include each other if they were brave enough to reach for them. Blackwood's retaliation came faster than Ronan had expected. 3 days after their confrontation, he rode into Stone Creek for supplies and found doors closing in his face. The general store, where he'd traded for 7 years, suddenly had nothing in stock that he needed. The feed store claimed they were waiting on a shipment and couldn't help him. Even the blacksmith, a gruff Norwegian named Olsen, who'd always been friendly, looked uncomfortable and said he was too busy to take on new work. Ronan stood in the middle of the muddy main street, watching people avoid his eyes, and felt the invisible weight of Blackwood's influence settling over the town like a blanket. This was how it worked: quiet pressure, unspoken threats, the subtle message that anyone who did business with Ronan Hale would find themselves on the wrong side of the valley's most powerful man. He was about to climb back on his horse and ride the extra 30 miles to the next town when a voice called out from behind him, Ronan Hale? That you? Ronan turned to find a wiry man in his 60s approaching, one hand extended in greeting. The man's face was weathered as old leather, his eyes sharp and knowing. Ronan recognized him after a moment. Thomas Reed, owner of a small ranch on the western edge of the valley. They'd met a few times over the years, brief exchanges in town, but had never had cause for extended conversation. "Mr. Reed," Ronan said, shaking the offered hand. "Good to see you." "Heard you've made an enemy of Silas Blackwood," Reed said without preamble. "Word travels fast in a town this small. Want to tell me your side of it?" Ronan hesitated, then decided he had nothing to lose by honesty. Quickly and quietly, he explained about Evelyn, about finding her half-frozen at his door, about Blackwood's abandonment of her in the storm, and his subsequent threats. Reed listened without interruption, his expression growing darker as the story progressed. When Ronan finished, Reed spat in the dirt. "That sounds like Blackwood, all right. Man thinks his money makes him God. Been pushing people around in this valley for 20 years, and most folks are too scared or too indebted to stand up to him." He paused, then added, "I'm not most folks." "I appreciate that," Ronan said carefully. "But I don't want to drag you into trouble that's not yours." "Too late for that," Reed said with a grim smile. "Blackwood tried to buy my land 5 years back, offered me half what it was worth. When I refused, he tried to starve me out, same tricks he's pulling on you now. But I'm stubborn as a mule and twice as mean when riled. I survived, and he's hated me ever since. So you helping that girl? That makes you all right in my book. And anyone Blackwood hates is a friend of mine." Relief washed over Ronan, unexpected in its intensity. He hadn't realized how much the town's rejection had affected him until Reed's offer of friendship eased the tightness in his chest. "Thank you," he said simply. "Don't thank me yet," Reed said. "Blackwood's not going to let this drop. He'll escalate, try to force your hand. You need to be ready for that, both you and the girl." He paused, studying Ronan's face with those sharp eyes. "She's staying with you? At your cabin?" "She's working for me," Ronan said, hearing the defensiveness in his own voice. "Hired hand, all proper and legal." Reed snorted. "Sure she is, and I'm the Emperor of China. Look, son, I don't care what arrangement you've got with her. That's your business. But you should know people are talking, and not all of it's friendly. A young woman living alone with a bachelor in a remote cabin? That's the kind of thing gets tongues wagging, especially when Blackwood's got his people spreading rumors." "What kind of rumors?" Ronan asked, though he could guess. "That she's your mistress, that you're keeping her there against her will, that she's not right in the head from her ordeal, and you're taking advantage. All lies, I'm sure, but lies don't need to be true to do damage. They just need to be repeated often enough." Reed clapped him on the shoulder. "My advice? Marry her. Make it legal and proper in a way nobody can argue with. Takes the wind right out of Blackwood's sails and protects both your reputations." Ronan felt heat rise in his face. "I can't just... We haven't... It's not like that between us." "Isn't it?" Reed asked, one eyebrow raised. "The way you talk about her, the way your whole face changes when you say her name. Son, I've been married 40 years. I know what a man in love looks like, even when he's too stubborn to admit it to himself." Before Ronan could respond, Reed continued, "Come by my place before you head home. I've got extra feed I can spare and some other supplies. Won't solve all your problems, but it'll help. And bring the girl around sometime. My wife Margaret would like to meet her, I expect. Woman could use some female company, living out there alone with just you for conversation." Reed walked away before Ronan could properly thank him, leaving Ronan standing in the street with his head spinning. Marry Evelyn? The thought was absurd. They'd known each other barely 2 weeks. She'd come here planning to marry someone else. She was vulnerable, dependent on him for survival. Taking advantage of that by proposing marriage would be wrong, exploitative, exactly the kind of thing a man like Blackwood would do. Except it wouldn't be like that, a quiet voice in his head insisted. Because you love her. Because she said she cares about you too. Because Reed's right. Making it legal would protect both of you, give you both standing that Blackwood can't easily attack. Ronan shook his head sharply, trying to clear it. He couldn't think about this now. He had supplies to gather, a 30-mile ride ahead of him if Reed's offer didn't pan out, and a woman waiting at home who needed to know how bad things had gotten in town. Marriage could wait. Everything else could wait. Right now, survival was what mattered. He collected what Reed offered, generous amounts of feed, flour, salt, and other staples, and made the long ride back to the cabin as the sun sank toward the western mountains. The conversation with Reed played on repeat in his mind, particularly those last words. A man in love. Was that what this was? Was that what had been growing between him and Evelyn these past weeks? This feeling that made his chest ache and his thoughts drift constantly to her face, her voice, her laugh. The cabin came into view just as dusk was settling over the valley, smoke rising from the chimney into the purple sky. Ronan had sent word to Evelyn not to worry if he was late, but even so, she appeared on the porch before he'd finished unsaddling his horse, her expression anxious. "I was getting worried," she called. "You said noon at the latest." "Ran into complications," Ronan said, carrying supplies toward the cabin. "Blackwood's made good on his threats. Most of the town won't sell to me anymore." Evelyn's face fell. "Ronan, I'm so sorry. This is my fault. If I hadn't—" "Don't," he interrupted firmly. "Don't apologize for what he's doing. This is his choice, his vindictiveness, not your fault." He told her about his encounter with Reed as they carried supplies inside, about the unexpected friendship, and offered help. "He sounds like a good man," Evelyn said, organizing the supplies with practiced efficiency. "But he's right about the rumors, isn't he? About what people will think of me living here with you?" "Does it matter what they think?" Ronan asked. "We know the truth. That should be enough." "Should be," Evelyn agreed quietly. "But it's not, is it? Reputation matters, especially for women. If people think I'm your mistress or worse, that closes doors for me, limits what I can do or become, and it damages you too, makes you look like someone who takes advantage of vulnerable women." She was quiet for a moment, then added, "Mr. Reed suggested marriage, didn't he?" Ronan froze in the act of storing flour in the pantry. "How did you—" "Because it's the obvious solution," Evelyn said. "From a practical standpoint, at least. Marriage would make everything legal and proper, protect both our reputations, and give Blackwood no ground to stand on with his insinuations." She paused, then asked softly, "Did you tell him yes?" "I didn't tell him anything," Ronan said. "It's not— We can't just— Evelyn, you came here to marry one man and it turned into a nightmare. I'm not going to pressure you into marrying another just because it's convenient or practical. You deserve better than that. You deserve choice." Evelyn turned to face him fully, and there was something complicated in her expression. "What if I chose you?" she asked. "What if I said yes to a marriage between us? Would you want that?" Ronan's heart hammered against his ribs. "It's not about what I want. You're vulnerable right now, dependent on me. Any answer you give might be influenced by that, by feeling like you owe me or need to secure your position here. That's not a real choice, Evelyn. That's coercion dressed up as offering." "Don't tell me what I feel," Evelyn said, and there was heat in her voice now, color rising in her cheeks. "Don't tell me I'm too vulnerable or confused to know my own mind. I've had men make decisions for me my whole life. My father deciding what I should study, what I should read, what company I should keep. Employers deciding what hours I should work, what wages I deserved. Blackwood deciding I wasn't suitable, wasn't worthy of the life he'd promised. And now you, deciding that I'm too fragile to make choices about my own future? That's not what I'm doing," Ronan protested. "Isn't it?" Evelyn challenged. "You're deciding for both of us that we can't even discuss marriage because you've determined I'm not capable of giving real consent. But I am capable, Ronan. I'm perfectly capable of knowing what I want and choosing it. And what I want is—" She stopped, pressing her lips together as if physically holding back words. "What?" Ronan asked, moving closer. "What do you want?" Evelyn looked up at him, and he saw tears glittering in her eyes, though she refused to let them fall. "I want to stop being afraid," she said, her voice shaking. "I want to stop feeling like everything good can be taken away at any moment. I want to belong somewhere, to someone, in a way that's real and permanent and can't be dissolved with a $10 bill and a cruel letter. I want—" She took a shaky breath. I want you. But I'm terrified to say it because what if you don't feel the same? What if this is just charity and duty for you? What if I'm reading everything wrong and I'm about to humiliate myself? Ronan reached out and took her hands carefully, mindful of her healing fingers. It's not charity, he said roughly. It stopped being charity about 3 days after you arrived, when you made me laugh at something for the first time in 7 years. When you stood at that window and called this cabin a home built by honest hands, like it was something valuable. When you refused to hide from Blackwood and stood on that porch and faced him down like some avenging angel made of silk and steel. He pulled her closer, until only inches separated them. I'm not good at pretty words, Evelyn. I'm just a man who spent 7 years hiding from life because I was too broken and scared to risk getting hurt again. But you walked out of a blizzard and into my life and reminded me what it feels like to be alive, to care about something beyond just surviving, to want a future instead of just enduring the present. Ronan, she whispered, his name like a prayer. I love you, he said, and the words came easier than he'd imagined they would. I know it's too soon and too fast and probably too complicated, but I love you. And if you want to marry me, not because it's practical or convenient, but because you want to, then my answer is yes. It's been yes since you smiled at me over breakfast that first morning. I just didn't know it yet. Evelyn made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob, and then she was rising on her toes and kissing him, and Ronan was kissing her back, his arms coming around her to pull her close. She tasted like coffee and hope, and she fit against him like she'd been made to be there. The kiss was gentle and fierce all at once, tender and desperate. The kiss of two people who'd been alone too long and were terrified and grateful in equal measure to have found each other. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Evelyn pressed her forehead against his chest. Is this real? She asked. Please tell me this is real and not just desperation or loneliness or trauma making us both crazy. It's real, Ronan said, his voice rumbling through his chest where her head rested. At least, it's real for me. The most real thing I've felt in years. For me too, Evelyn said. She pulled back enough to look up at him, her eyes bright. So we're really doing this? Getting married? If you're sure, Ronan said. If this is really what you want and not just... Evelyn kissed him again, cutting off his words. I'm sure, she said against his lips. Stop trying to talk me out of it. I know my own mind, Ronan Hale, and I'm choosing you. I'm choosing this life, this cabin, this valley. I'm choosing us. They stood there in the middle of the cabin, holding each other as the fire crackled and night settled over the mountains. Outside, the world was still cold and dangerous, still full of threats from men like Blackwood, who thought power gave them the right to hurt others. But inside, something new was being born, a partnership, a promise, a future that neither of them had dared to imagine 2 weeks ago. The next morning dawned clear and cold, and they rode together to Thomas Reed's ranch. Margaret Reed turns out to be a sturdy woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner that reminded Ronan of his own mother. She took one look at Evelyn and immediately pulled her into a warm embrace, declaring that any woman who could survive what she'd been through deserved all the support other women could give. Tom told me about Blackwood, Margaret said, pouring coffee for all of them in her warm kitchen. That man's been a blight on this valley for too long. It's past time someone stood up to him. And you two getting married? That's exactly the right move. Practical and romantic all at once. We'll need a preacher, Ronan said. Is Reverend Matthews still in Stone Creek? Thomas and Margaret exchanged glances. He is, Thomas said carefully, but he might not be willing to perform the ceremony. Blackwood's a major donor to the church, and Matthews isn't known for his courage when it comes to standing up to his benefactors. There's a circuit preacher who comes through Liberty, Margaret offered. That's about 40 miles east. Good man. Won't care about Blackwood's opinions. We could ride there, make it a day trip, get you two properly married. The sooner the better, Thomas added, before Blackwood hears about it and tries to interfere. He's got enough influence that he might be able to cause problems if you give him time to act. They made plans to ride to Liberty in 3 days, which would give Evelyn time to prepare and give Ronan time to make the cabin more suitable for a married couple. That night, lying on his pallet on the floor, while Evelyn slept in the bed above him, Ronan found himself staring at the ceiling and marveling at how quickly his life had transformed. 2 weeks ago, he'd been alone and content with it. Now he was about to be married, about to bind his life to another person's in the most permanent way possible. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it filled him with something that felt like peace. The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation. Margaret rode over with a dress she said had been her daughter's, altered to fit Evelyn's smaller frame. It was simple but beautiful, deep green wool that brought out the color in Evelyn's eyes. Thomas brought extra food and supplies, enough to see them through winter without depending on Stone Creek's hostile merchants. And Ronan spent hours improving the cabin, building a proper privacy screen for one corner, adding hooks for clothes, crafting a small chest for Evelyn's belongings. Small things, but each one a statement that this was now their home, not just his. On the third day, they set out for Liberty under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Thomas and Margaret accompanied them, serving as witnesses and chaperones to maintain propriety. The ride took most of the day, but the weather held fair, and they reached the small town as the sun was beginning its descent toward the mountains. The circuit preacher was indeed a good man, a Methodist minister named Samuel Collins, who listened to their story with compassion and asked none of the prying questions Ronan had feared. He agreed to perform the ceremony immediately in the small church that served Liberty's scattered population. And so it was that Ronan Hale and Evelyn Ward were married in a simple ceremony with only the Reeds and the minister as witnesses. Evelyn wore Margaret's daughter's green dress and wildflowers in her hair that Margaret had somehow produced despite the season. Ronan wore his best shirt and pants, freshly washed and mended by Evelyn's careful hands. They spoke their vows in steady voices, promising to love and honor and cherish each other through whatever came. When Reverend Collins pronounced them husband and wife and told Ronan he could kiss his bride, Ronan cupped Evelyn's face in his hands and kissed her with all the tenderness and promise he possessed. She kissed him back, smiling against his lips, and he heard Margaret sniffle behind them. They signed the marriage certificate, making it legal and binding, and Reverend Collins gave them a copy to keep. "In case anyone questions it," he said quietly, "I've heard some of what you've faced. This document proves you're married in the eyes of God and the law. No one can argue with that." They rode back to the Reed Ranch as darkness fell, and Margaret insisted they stay the night rather than try to make it home in the dark. She prepared a feast to celebrate, roast chicken and potatoes and pie made with preserved berries, and they ate and laughed and for a few hours forgot about Blackwood and threats and everything beyond the warm glow of the Reed's kitchen. That night, given this guest room with its double bed, Ronan and Evelyn lay side by side, still dressed, staring at the ceiling. Neither of them had spoken about what came next, about what their wedding night should entail. Finally, Evelyn broke the silence. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do," she admitted softly. "I know the mechanics, obviously. My father was a professor. I had access to medical texts that explain things. But the reality of it, the actual experience, I don't know." Ronan turned on his side to face her. "We don't have to do anything tonight," he said. "We're married. We have the rest of our lives. There's no rush." "But I want to," Evelyn said, turning to meet his eyes. "I want this to be real in every way. I'm nervous. What if I do it wrong?" Ronan brushed her hair back from her face, his touch gentle. "There's no wrong way. We'll figure it out together, and if tonight's not the right time, that's okay too. No pressure, Evelyn. No expectations except that we're honest with each other." She studied his face in the dim light from the window. "You're a good man, Ronan Hale. Better than I deserve." "No," he said firmly. "I'm the one who doesn't deserve you. You're brave and strong and beautiful, and somehow you chose me. I'm the luckiest man in Wyoming territory." Evelyn smiled and leaned in to kiss him, and this time, when they came together, it was different than before. This was the kiss of husband and wife, of promises made and kept, of a future no longer uncertain. And when they finally pulled apart, breathless and wanting, Evelyn whispered, "I'm ready. Show me what comes next." Ronan did, with patience and tenderness and a care that brought tears to her eyes. They learned each other slowly, carefully, mapping new territory together with hands that trembled and hearts that raced. It was awkward and sweet and perfect in its imperfection, and afterward, lying tangled together with Evelyn's head on his chest and her hand over his heart, Ronan felt something he'd thought lost to him forever. He felt complete. They returned to Ronan's cabin, their cabin now, the next morning, riding through snow that sparkled in the bright sunlight. When they crested the last hill and the cabin came into view, Evelyn reined in her horse and just looked at it for a long moment. "What is it?" Ronan asked, stopping beside her. "I was just thinking," she said, "that 2 weeks ago I thought my life was over. I thought I was going to die in that storm, cold and alone and forgotten. And now—" She gestured at the cabin, at Ronan, at the valley spread out before them. "Now I have this, a home, a husband, a future. How did I get so lucky?" "We both got lucky," Ronan said. "That storm brought us together, brought us exactly what we needed, even if we didn't know we needed it." They rode down to the cabin together, and Ronan lifted Evelyn down from her horse, then surprised her by picking her up completely and carrying her to the door. "Tradition," he explained at her startled laugh. "Supposed to carry you over the threshold as husband and wife." "Then by all means," Evelyn said, wrapping her arms around his neck. "Carry me home, husband." Ronan did, kicking the door open and carrying her into the cabin that was now truly theirs. He set her down gently, and they stood there in the middle of the room, holding each other, while Bear danced around them, excited by their return. That night, as they lay in bed together, properly together now, sharing the space that Ronan had insisted she take alone for so many nights, Evelyn spoke into the darkness. "Blackwood's going to be furious when he finds out we're married." "Let him be furious," Ronan said, tightening his arm around her. "He can't touch us now. You're my wife, legally and properly. He has no claim on you, no power over you, and if he tries anything, he'll have to go through me." "Do you think he'll try?" Evelyn asked. Ronan was quiet for a moment, considering. "Yes," he said finally, "I think he'll try something. Men like Blackwood don't let go of grudges easily, but whatever he does, we'll face it together. That's what marriage means, right? Facing things together instead of alone?" "Together," Evelyn agreed, and there was strength in her voice despite the fear underlying it. "I like the sound of that." Outside, wind whispered through the pines and an owl called from somewhere in the darkness. Inside, husband and wife slept, protected by walls built by honest hands, sustained by love that had grown from impossible circumstances, bound together by vows spoken in a small church and sealed in each other's arms. The future was uncertain, and threats still waited beyond their door, but for tonight they were safe. For tonight, they had everything they needed. And in the morning, they would face whatever came next together. Word of their marriage reached Blackwood within a week, carried by the same gossip network that had spread rumors about Evelyn living alone with Ronan. Thomas Reed made sure the news traveled fast and far, stopping by the general store in Stone Creek to loudly congratulate anyone who would listen on the fine wedding he'd witnessed, how proper and legal it had been, how the circuit preacher had pronounced them husband and wife in front of God and witnesses. By the time the story made its rounds, half the valley knew that Ronan Hale had married the woman Silas Blackwood had abandoned in a blizzard. The response from Blackwood came on a bitter cold morning 2 weeks after the wedding. Ronan was in the barn feeding the horses when Bear started barking with an urgency that brought him running outside, rifle in hand. A rider was approaching fast, and as he got closer, Ronan recognized the sheriff's badge glinting on his coat. Behind him came 3 more riders, and Ronan's jaw tightened as he recognized Silas Blackwood among them. "Evelyn, stay inside," Ronan called toward the cabin, but she was already on the porch, her expression wary but unafraid. Sheriff Palmer reined in his horse a respectful distance from the cabin, his weathered face showing discomfort with his mission. He'd been sheriff for 15 years, a fair man by most accounts, but one who understood which side his bread was buttered on. Blackwood sat his horse with barely contained rage, his face florid, his small eyes fixed on Evelyn with an intensity that made Ronan's hand tighten on his rifle. "Morning, Ronan," Palmer said, tipping his hat. "Mrs. Hale." He nodded to Evelyn, acknowledging her new status. "I'm sorry to disturb you folks, but Mr. Blackwood here has made some serious allegations that I'm obliged to investigate." "What kind of allegations?" Ronan asked, his voice level despite the anger building in his chest. Blackwood urged his horse forward, ignoring Palmer's warning hand. "That woman," he spat, pointing at Evelyn, "stole from me money and documents from my office. I want her arrested and my property returned." Evelyn's face went pale, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "I stole nothing from you, Mr. Blackwood. I never set foot in your office. The only thing I took from your property was my own life, which you tried to take from me." "Lies," Blackwood snarled. "You're a thief and a fraud, and you seduced this fool into marriage to protect yourself. Sheriff, I demand you search their property and arrest her immediately." Palmer shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Mr. Blackwood, I can't just search someone's home without cause. If you're making an accusation of theft, you need to provide evidence. What exactly is missing?" $500 in cash and a deed to property on the Eastern Range, Blackwood said promptly. "Taken from my desk the night before the storm. She was the only stranger on my property that day, the only person with opportunity." "I was never in your house," Evelyn said firmly. "Your foreman drove me directly from the train station to where you met us on the road. I never saw your ranch, never entered your home, never had any opportunity to take anything. Your foreman can confirm that if you haven't intimidated him into lying for you." "My foreman is dead," Blackwood said flatly. "Thrown from his horse 3 days ago. Very unfortunate accident. So it's your word against mine, and I know which one the law will believe." The casual way he said it, the slight emphasis on accident, sent ice through Ronan's veins. The foreman had been the only witness to what really happened that day, the only one who could confirm Evelyn's story about being abandoned. And now he was conveniently dead, and Blackwood was using his death to eliminate evidence while simultaneously framing Evelyn for theft. "That's convenient for you," Ronan said quietly, and something in his tone made Palmer's hand drift toward his sidearm. "The only witness to what you did, gone. Now you can say whatever you want about that day." "Are you accusing me of something, Hale?" Blackwood asked, his voice dangerous. "I'm saying the timing is suspicious," Ronan replied. "Your foreman dies just as you're making accusations against my wife? That's quite a coincidence." Palmer cleared his throat. "Gentlemen, let's keep this civil. Mr. Blackwood, without your foreman to provide testimony, and without any evidence placing Mrs. Hale in your home, I'm not sure I can pursue these charges. It's your word against hers, and she's given a reasonable account of why she couldn't have done what you're claiming." "She has a letter," Blackwood said suddenly. "A letter I wrote dissolving our marriage agreement. She claims I gave it to her, but I say she stole it from my desk along with the money. That letter is my property, Sheriff. I demand you confiscate it as evidence." Ronan understood immediately what Blackwood was doing. The letter was the only physical proof of what had happened that day, the only document that showed Blackwood had abandoned Evelyn. If Palmer took it as evidence of theft, it would disappear into Blackwood's pocket, and Evelyn would have no proof of her story. "The letter proves what he did to me," Evelyn said, her voice rising. "That's why he wants it. He's not worried about theft, Sheriff. He's worried about his reputation. He wants to destroy the evidence of his crime." "What crime?" Blackwood demanded. "Being disappointed in a mail-order bride? Dissolving a contract that both parties entered freely? There's no crime in that, just a business arrangement that didn't work out. But theft is a crime, and I want justice." Palmer looked between them, clearly torn. He knew Blackwood's power in the valley, knew what crossing him could cost. But he also seemed to recognize the holes in Blackwood's story, the suspicious timing, the way everything aligned too conveniently with Blackwood's interests. "I'll need to see this letter," Palmer said finally. "Not to confiscate it, but to examine it. If it's evidence in either direction, I need to know what it says." Evelyn looked at Ronan, who nodded. She went inside and returned a moment later with the envelope, handling it carefully. Palmer dismounted and took it, reading it slowly while Blackwood watched with barely concealed fury. The letter was damning. Even Palmer, reading it with a lawman's eye, couldn't miss the cruelty in Blackwood's words, the casual dismissal of a woman's life, the clear evidence that he'd intended to send her away. When he finished reading, Palmer folded it carefully and handed it back to Evelyn. "This letter supports Mrs. Hale's version of events," he said quietly. "It shows you dissolved the marriage contract and paid her off, Mr. Blackwood. It doesn't prove she stole anything from you. In fact, it suggests she had no reason to be in your home at all." "She could have written it herself," Blackwood blustered, "forged my handwriting to support her lies." "Is this your handwriting?" Palmer asked, showing him the letter. Blackwood's face went from red to purple. That is, It might have been written under duress. She could have forced me somehow. A woman barely 5 feet tall forced you to write a letter? Palmer's skepticism was evident now. Mr. Blackwood, I've known you a long time, and I've looked the other way on some things because that's how small towns work. But this? This feels wrong. Your story has holes in it. Your only witness is conveniently dead, and this letter suggests the truth is a lot uglier than you're admitting. Are you calling me a liar? Blackwood's voice was dangerously soft. I'm saying I can't arrest Mrs. Hale based on what you've given me, Palmer said firmly. If you want to pursue charges, you'll need to present better evidence. Until then, she's a married woman living with her husband on their own property, and she's broken no law that I can see. Blackwood stared at Palmer with pure hatred, then shifted his gaze to Ronan and Evelyn. This isn't over, he said, his voice shaking with rage. You think you've won something here? You've won nothing. I'll destroy you both. I'll make sure everyone in this valley knows what kind of people you are. I'll ruin you financially, socially, every way I can. By the time I'm done, you'll wish you'd never crossed me. We're already ruined socially, thanks to your rumors, Ronan said calmly. And financially, we're self-sufficient. We don't need your stores or your goodwill. We've got friends who'll trade with us, land that's ours free and clear, and each other. You can't take any of that away. Can't I? Blackwood smiled, and it was a terrible thing to see. We'll see about that. Sheriff, you've made your position clear. I'll remember that come election time. As for you two, he pointed at Ronan and Evelyn, enjoy your little cabin while you can. Winter's not over yet, and a lot can happen in a long, cold winter. He wheeled his horse around and rode off, his 2 men following. Palmer watched them go, then turned back to Ronan and Evelyn with genuine concern on his weathered face. You two need to be careful, he said quietly. Blackwood's not used to losing, and he's got the money and influence to make trouble in ways you might not expect. Watch your backs, lock your doors, and if anything suspicious happens, anything at all, you send word to me immediately. Understood? Understood, Ronan said. And Sheriff? Thank you for not just taking his word for it. Palmer shrugged. I'm not perfect, and I've let Blackwood get away with more than I should over the years, but I won't help him frame an innocent woman for theft. There's a line, and that crosses it. He mounted his horse and tipped his hat. Take care of yourselves, both of you. They watched him ride away, and only when he disappeared from view did Evelyn let out the breath she'd been holding. She sagged against the porch railing, and Ronan was immediately beside her, supporting her with one arm. I thought he was going to arrest me, she whispered. When Blackwood said that about the theft, I was so sure Palmer would believe him. Palmer's not completely in Blackwood's pocket, Ronan said, and your letter saved us. Blackwood couldn't explain it away, couldn't make it fit his story. It's proof, Evelyn. Proof that we're telling the truth. But his foreman is dead, Evelyn said, looking up at him with frightened eyes. Ronan, do you think Blackwood killed him, to silence him? Ronan wanted to say no, wanted to reassure her that even Blackwood wouldn't go that far. But he remembered the casual way Blackwood had mentioned the death, the slight emphasis that suggested it was anything but accidental. I don't know, he said honestly, but if he did, there's nothing we can do about it, and it means he's more dangerous than we thought. We need to be very, very careful. The next week passed with agonizing tension. Every sound in the night made them both jolt awake. Every time Ronan left to check the animals, Evelyn stood on the porch with the rifle, watching until he returned safely. They'd moved from newlywed bliss to living under siege, and the strain was beginning to show on both of them. It was Thomas Reed who brought them hope, riding up one morning with news that lit a fire in his eyes. He burst into the cabin without knocking, startling both of them. I found something, he said without preamble. Something that might help you against Blackwood. They gathered around the table while Thomas pulled papers from his saddlebag. After that business with the sheriff, I started asking questions. Talked to people who've worked for Blackwood over the years, people who might know his secrets. And I found a woman in Liberty, used to be his housekeeper, left his employment 5 years back. She told me things, and she's willing to testify if it comes to it. Testify to what? Ronan asked. Blackwood's done this before, Thomas said grimly. The mail-order bride thing. 4 times in the last 10 years, he's brought women out here, found them unsuitable, and sent them away. 3 of them disappeared. No record of them leaving on the train. No one saw them in town after Blackwood rejected them. Just gone, like they never existed. The fourth one made it back east, but she was so traumatized by whatever happened that she never spoke about it again. Evelyn had gone white. He's killed women before, is that what you're saying? I'm saying women disappeared, and Blackwood was the last person to see them, Thomas said carefully. Can't prove murder without bodies, but the pattern is clear. And the housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, she said Blackwood told her once when he was drunk that unsuitable wives were like lame horses. Sometimes the kindest thing was to put them down before they suffered. That's not proof, Ronan said, even as his stomach churned with horror. It's hearsay from a former employee. No court would convict on that. No, Thomas agreed. But it's a pattern. It's evidence that Evelyn wasn't the first, that this is how Blackwood operates. And there's more. Mrs. Patterson kept records, copies of letters Blackwood received from these women, records of money he spent bringing them out here. She kept them because she knew something was wrong, knew someone might need them someday. And she's willing to give them to us, willing to testify about what she saw and heard. Hope bloomed in Ronan's chest, fragile but real. If we can show a pattern of behavior, show that Blackwood has done this multiple times, it changes everything. It's not just one woman's word against his anymore. It's evidence of repeated behavior. Exactly, Thomas said. And I've got another piece of news. Remember how Blackwood said money and a deed were stolen from his desk? I did some checking with the land office. There's no record of any deed being reported stolen, no insurance claim filed. If he'd really lost a deed to valuable property, he'd have reported it immediately, started the process of getting a replacement. But he didn't, because there was no stolen deed. He made the whole thing up to try to get that letter from Evelyn. Evelyn stood and paced to the window, her arms wrapped around herself. So what do we do with this information? Take it to the sheriff? Better, Thomas said. We take it to the territorial marshal in Cheyenne. Marshal Davis doesn't answer to local money or influence. If we can present him with evidence of a pattern of women disappearing, of possible murders, he'll have to investigate. And once there's an official investigation, Blackwood loses his power. He can't intimidate a federal marshal the way he can intimidate local law. It's a 3-day ride to Cheyenne, Ronan said, thinking out loud. In winter, through country that's still dangerous with snow. I'll go with you, Thomas offered. Margaret can stay here with Evelyn, keep her company and safe while we're gone. 2 men traveling together is safer than one, and I know the route. We can make it there and back in a week, maybe less if the weather holds. Ronan looked at Evelyn, who was staring out the window at the snow-covered valley. What do you think? He asked her. It's your life we're talking about, your safety. You should have a say in this. Evelyn turned to face them, and there was steel in her expression. I think we end this, she said firmly. I think we stop living in fear and take the fight to him. If there's evidence that Blackwood has hurt other women, then we have a responsibility to make sure he can't hurt anyone else. Those women who disappeared, they deserve justice, even if it comes too late. And we deserve to live our lives without constantly looking over our shoulders. Then we go to Cheyenne, Ronan said, as soon as we can prepare for the journey. They spent the next day getting ready. Margaret Reed came to stay with Evelyn, bringing enough supplies to keep them comfortable for 2 weeks if needed. Ronan packed carefully, food, warm clothing, his rifle, and ammunition. Thomas brought the records Mrs. Patterson had given him, secured in a waterproof oilskin pouch. The morning they were set to leave, Ronan held Evelyn close on the cabin porch, reluctant to let her go even though he knew this trip was necessary. Promise me you'll be careful, she whispered against his chest. Promise me you'll come back to me. I promise, he said, tilting her face up to kiss her. Nothing's going to keep me from coming back to you. Not weather, not distance, not Blackwood. You're my wife, Evelyn. That means something. That means everything. I love you, she said, and even after weeks of marriage, the words still made his heart skip. I love you too, he replied. Stay safe. Listen to Margaret. And if Blackwood shows up here, I'll shoot him, Evelyn said matter-of-factly. And Ronan believed her. The ride to Cheyenne was brutal. The main roads were clear enough, but the cold was relentless, and they had to stop frequently to warm themselves and rest the horses. They rode from dawn to dusk, pushing as hard as they dared, and made camp each night in whatever shelter they could find. Abandoned line shacks, caves, once under a rocky overhang that barely kept the snow off. On the third day, they rode into Cheyenne as the sun was setting, both of them half frozen and exhausted. They found a boarding house, arranged for hot baths and hot food, and spent the evening warming themselves by the fire and planning their approach to the marshal. Marshal Davis turned out to be a lean man in his 50s with sharp eyes and a skeptical manner. He listened to their story without interruption, reading through Mrs. Patterson's records with careful attention. When they finished, he sat back in his chair and regarded them thoughtfully. "That's quite an accusation you're making," he said finally. "Silas Blackwood is a wealthy, influential man. Accusing him of multiple murders is serious business." "We're not accusing," Thomas said. "We're presenting evidence of a pattern and asking you to investigate. Women came to Wyoming to marry him. Those women disappeared. That's fact, not accusation." "Fact is they disappeared," Davis agreed. "But disappearing isn't the same as being murdered. Women could leave, could go elsewhere, could change their names and start over. Happens all the time." "4 women," Ronan challenged. 4 women all brought out by the same man, all rejected by him, all vanishing without a trace? That's not coincidence, Marshal. That's a pattern." Davis was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming on his desk. "I'll investigate," he said finally. "Not because I'm convinced Blackwood killed anyone, but because the pattern is suspicious enough to warrant looking into. I'll need statements from all of you, and I'll need to interview this Mrs. Patterson myself. And I'll need to talk to people in Stone Creek, see if anyone remembers these women, if there are any records of them leaving." "What about my wife?" Ronan asked. "Blackwood tried to have her arrested on false charges. He's threatened us repeatedly. She's in danger as long as he's free." "If I start an investigation, Blackwood will know he's being watched," Davis said. "That might make him more cautious, less likely to try anything overt. But I can't arrest him based on suspicion and missing persons from years ago. I need evidence, bodies, witnesses. Until I have that, all I can do is investigate and hope he's stupid enough to reveal himself." It wasn't the answer Ronan wanted, but it was something. They spent 2 more days in Cheyenne giving statements, providing every detail they could remember, helping Davis build his case. Mrs. Patterson came from Liberty and told her story with quiet dignity, holding nothing back. And slowly, Davis's skepticism began to shift toward genuine concern. "I'll send deputies to Stone Creek," he told them on their last day. "Quietly, to start asking questions. And I'll put out notices to other marshals, see if any of these missing women turned up elsewhere under different names. It'll take time, maybe months, but I'll get to the bottom of this. You have my word." They rode back toward home with that promise, and with the knowledge that for the first time someone with real authority was taking their concerns seriously. The weather had turned colder during their absence, and snow fell steadily as they made their way back through the mountains. On the second day of their return journey, as they were crossing a narrow pass, Thomas suddenly held up his hand. "Wait," he said quietly. "Something's wrong." Ronan followed his gaze and felt his blood run cold. Smoke was rising from somewhere ahead. Too much smoke for a normal fire, black and thick against the gray sky. It was coming from the direction of his cabin. They rode hard then, pushing their tired horses to dangerous speeds through the snow. Ronan's mind raced with terrible possibilities. Blackwood had burned them out. Evelyn was hurt. Margaret was hurt. Everything they'd built was gone. The smoke grew thicker as they got closer, and then they crested the final ridge and looked down at the valley. The cabin still stood, untouched, but Blackwood's ranch house, visible in the distance to the east, was engulfed in flames. Even from miles away, they could see the massive structure burning, black smoke pouring into the sky. They rode down to the cabin at a more cautious pace and found Evelyn and Margaret standing in the yard, both of them staring at the distant fire. Evelyn turned at the sound of hooves and ran to Ronan, and he caught her in his arms, lifting her off the ground. "What happened?" he demanded. "Are you all right? Did Blackwood—" "We're fine," Evelyn said quickly. "We've been here the whole time, but Blackwood's ranch, it started burning this morning. We could see the flames from here. I don't know what happened." They found out 2 days later when Sheriff Palmer rode out to the cabin with news. Blackwood's ranch house had burned to the ground in a fire that started in the middle of the night. Silas Blackwood had died in that fire. along with 2 of his men. The rest of his household had escaped, but Blackwood himself had apparently been too drunk to wake up in time. They'd found his body in what remained of his bedroom. "Accidental fire," Palmer said, but something in his tone suggested he didn't quite believe it. "Probably started by a knocked-over lantern or a spark from the fireplace. These old ranch houses, they go up fast once fire takes hold." "Convenient," Thomas murmured. "Very," Palmer agreed. "Almost as convenient as his foreman's accident." He looked at Ronan directly. "Marshal Davis sent word that he was investigating Blackwood for possible involvement in several disappearances. Now Blackwood's dead, and the investigation will likely die with him. No way to prosecute a dead man, after all." "What about his ranch?" Ronan asked. "His property?" "Will go to his next of kin, I expect. He's got a nephew back east, I'm told. Whether the nephew will want to run a ranch in Wyoming or sell everything and go home, that's anyone's guess." Palmer shifted in his saddle. "Point is, your troubles with Blackwood are over. He can't threaten you anymore, can't spread rumors or cause problems. You two can finally live in peace." After Palmer left, Ronan and Evelyn stood on their porch watching the sun set over the valley. The smoke had finally cleared from Blackwood's ranch, leaving only a black scar on the landscape where his house had stood. "Do you think someone killed him?" Evelyn asked quietly. "Set the fire deliberately?" "I don't know," Ronan said. "And I don't think I want to know. Justice isn't always clean or legal, Evelyn. Sometimes it's just justice, however it comes." "Those women who disappeared," Evelyn said. "They'll never get real justice now. Their families will never know what happened to them." "No," Ronan agreed. "But maybe knowing Blackwood can't hurt anyone else is justice enough. It's not perfect, but it's something." They stood in silence for a while, and then Evelyn said, "I want to move forward now. Not forget what happened, but stop letting it define us. I want to build a life here, a real life, with you." Ronan pulled her close, and they stood watching the sunset paint the snow in shades of gold and pink. "What kind of life do you want?" he asked. "A full one," Evelyn said. "I want to expand the ranch, bring in more cattle. I want to build relationships with our neighbors, become part of this valley instead of just existing in it. I want to maybe teach children to read. If any of the families around here need a teacher, I want to have children of our own someday, fill this cabin with life and laughter." She looked up at him. "I want to prove that good things can come from terrible beginnings, that love can grow in the coldest places, that people like us can build something beautiful even after everything tried to destroy us." "That sounds like a good life," Ronan said, his voice thick with emotion. "Sounds like everything I never knew I wanted until you walked out of that storm and into my life." The months that followed were transformative. With Blackwood gone, the town's attitude toward them slowly shifted. People who'd refused to trade with them before cautiously reopened their doors. Other small ranchers, emboldened by Blackwood's absence, became friendlier, more willing to share resources and knowledge. The valley, which had operated under Blackwood's shadow for so long, seemed to exhale and relax. Thomas and Margaret Reed became like family, riding over regularly to share meals and stories. Mrs. Patterson visited once from Liberty, spending a week with them and teaching Evelyn more about preserving food and managing a household in harsh conditions. Sheriff Palmer stopped by occasionally, ostensibly to check on them, but really, Ronan suspected, to assuage his guilt about all the times he'd looked the other way when Blackwood wielded his power. Spring came slowly, melting the snow inch by inch and revealing the valley's bones beneath. Ronan and Evelyn worked side by side, repairing winter damage, expanding their herd, planting a kitchen garden in a plot Ronan cleared near the cabin. They talked about building a larger house eventually, something with separate rooms and space for the children they hoped to have. But for now, the cabin was enough. It held them, and their dreams, and their growing love, and that was all they needed. In late May, a lawyer from Cheyenne came with news that Blackwood's nephew had indeed sold the ranch. The buyer was a consortium of smaller ranchers who planned to divide the land among themselves, breaking up Blackwood's empire into manageable pieces that would benefit the whole valley, rather than enriching one man. Ronan and Evelyn were offered the opportunity to buy a parcel that bordered their existing property, expanding their holdings at a fair price. They accepted, and suddenly their small ranch became something more substantial, something that could support not just survival, but prosperity. Ronan hired 2 hands to help with the increased workload, young men from town who were grateful for honest work at fair wages. The cabin became the center of a small but thriving operation. And through it all, Evelyn bloomed. The frightened, half-frozen woman who'd collapsed at Ronan's door transformed into someone confident and capable. Someone who could bargain with merchants, nurse sick cattle, and shoot straight enough to bring down the deer that supplemented their diet. She started a small school in Stone Creek, teaching children to read 3 days a week, and became beloved by the families whose children she educated. She made friends, built community, and established herself as someone who mattered in the valley. 5 years after that terrible night when she'd knocked on Ronan's door, Evelyn stood in the yard of their new house, 2 stories with real glass windows and a porch that wrapped around 3 sides, and watched her children play in the grass. James, their son, was 4 years old and had his father's steady temperament. Sarah, named for the girl Ronan had left behind in Pennsylvania so many years ago, was 2 and had her mother's fierce spirit. A 3rd child grew beneath Evelyn's heart, due before winter came. Ronan came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About storms," Evelyn said. "About how the worst night of my life turned into the best thing that ever happened to me. About how I was so sure I was going to die out there in the snow, and instead I found a life more full and rich than anything I'd imagined in Boston." "No regrets?" Ronan asked softly. "None," Evelyn said firmly. "Not about answering that advertisement, not about the blizzard, not about Blackwood or any of it, because all of it led me here, to you, to this life we've built together. I wouldn't change a single moment, Ronan, because changing anything might mean I never ended up at your door that night." They stood together watching their children play, watching the sun set over the valley they'd claimed as their own. In the distance, where Blackwood's ranch had once stood, wildflowers now grew among the ruins, nature reclaiming what man had tried to dominate. Other families had moved into the valley, drawn by word that it was no longer controlled by one tyrant, that there was room for honest people to build honest lives. "Sometimes I think about those other women," Evelyn said quietly. "The ones who came before me, the ones who disappeared. I think about how I was supposed to be just another one of them, another woman erased from history. And I wonder why I survived when they didn't." "Because you were strong," Ronan said. "Because you chose the wrong fork, and that choice saved your life. Because you kept walking when anyone else would have laid down and died. Because you were brave enough to knock on a stranger's door instead of giving up." "Because you opened that door," Evelyn corrected. "Because you could have turned me away, could have decided I was too much trouble or too much risk. But you didn't. You saved my life, Ronan, in every way a person can be saved." "We saved each other," Ronan said. And it was true. She'd saved him from a lonely existence, from slow death by isolation, from a life half-lived in fear and solitude. And he'd saved her from the storm, from Blackwood's cruelty, from a world that had tried to convince her she was worthless. That night, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Ronan and Evelyn sat on their porch watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. A letter had come that day from Marshal Davis, informing them that his investigation into the missing women had uncovered enough evidence to confirm what they'd suspected, that at least 3 of them had almost certainly died at Blackwood's hands, their bodies likely hidden somewhere on his vast property. Searchers would continue looking, Davis wrote, so that the women could be properly buried and their families could have closure. "At least now people know," Evelyn said, holding the letter. "At least their stories won't be forgotten completely." "No," Ronan agreed. "They won't be forgotten. And neither will you be, Evelyn Hale. You survived when you shouldn't have, thrived when everything tried to break you. That means something. That matters." "We matter," Evelyn corrected, taking his hand. "This life we've built, this family we're raising, this community we're part of, all of it matters. We took something terrible and made it beautiful. That's our victory, Ronan. Not over Blackwood. He's gone and doesn't matter anymore. Our victory is this." She gestured at their house, their land, the valley spread out before them. "This is what we built from that awful night. This is our answer to cruelty and injustice and all the things that tried to destroy us. We built love. We built home. We built family." Ronan pulled her close and kissed her forehead, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the warmth of her body against his. "I love you," he said simply. "More than I have words for. You changed my life, Evelyn. Made it worth living." "I love you too," she replied. "Thank you for opening your door that night. Thank you for every kindness, every protection, every moment of love you've given me since. Thank you for building this life with me." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars multiplied overhead and the night sounds of the valley rose around them. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called and another answered. An owl hooted from the pines. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of wildflowers and sage and the promise of another good harvest to come. Inside their house, their children slept safely, warm and loved and protected by walls built by honest hands. Around them, their neighbors were settling into their own homes, living their own lives, building their own dreams on land that was finally free from tyranny. And beside Ronan, his wife, his partner, his salvation, his greatest unexpected gift, sat with their future growing beneath her heart and hope shining in her eyes. The storm that brought them together was long past, the snow melted, the cold forgotten. But what they'd built from that terrible night would endure. A testament to the truth that sometimes the fiercest storms don't destroy lives. Sometimes, against all odds and expectations, they begin them. Sometimes they bring exactly what's needed, even if it arrives frozen and frightened and half dead at a lonely cabin door. Sometimes they bring love. Sometimes they bring home. Sometimes they bring everything. And as Ronan and Evelyn Hale sat together under the Wyoming stars, surrounded by the life they'd fought for and built together, they knew with absolute certainty that every moment of cold, every instant of fear, every threat they'd faced had been worth it. Because it had brought them here, to this moment, to each other, to a future that stretched out bright and full in theirs. The blizzard had given them everything, and they would spend the rest of their lives honoring that gift by living fully, loving fiercely, and proving that even the darkest storms can carry unexpected blessings for those brave enough to survive them.